It's Halloween, everyone, so we thought that maybe while you were, carving your pumpkins or gathering your candy or getting into that slutty nurse's uniform, that we give you this compilation of spooky true crime stories. And some just random spooky stuff because, spooky. Halloween's a favorite here in the Scott household. We're all in the spirit. Aren't we, Zoe? So she's got her outfit on, so let's start things off with one of my truest true crime stories I've ever covered. And I say truest because this video is kind of, to my knowledge, the only one on YouTube that tells this guy's actual story and not the legend. My writer Ryan did a bang-up job of researching this and digging up all this stuff that's not normally covered. But what I came to find out was that the true story is actually just as crazy, maybe even crazier, than the legend. And I'm really proud of this video. Like I said, I think we're the only people that have ever really covered it in this way. So here is the true story of America's first serial killer, HH Holmes. According to the FBI, at any given time, there's 25 to 50 serial killers currently operating in the United States. Cool! Sleep tight, kids. We also have the highest number of serial killers per capita in the whole world. USA! 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 A serial killer is defined by the FBI as somebody who kills more than 3 people over the span of more than a month, with emotional cooling off periods in between. But the general popular version of what a serial killer is somebody who basically gets off on hurting and inflicting pain on other people. And while we think of serial killers as a fairly, modern phenomenon, there's always been a small percentage of the population that has no empathy and gets pleasure out of seeing other people suffering. I mean, somebody's got to work the phones at Comcast customer support. But we've always been fascinated by bandits and outlaws, the gunslingers of the Old West, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, those kinds of guys, whose stories have become so sensationalized over the years, it's hard to tell the difference between truth and legend. So even though they were definitely, bad guys that you wouldn't want to run into in a dark alley or anything, the newspapers just reveled in their adventures and sometimes even painted them as a hero, people that are fighting against the system and killing to stay alive and to square bad deals. Serial killers, that was another thing. That's not some hero trying to, buck the system or something. That is a sadistic bastard who gets off on murdering women and small children. That's somebody punching down, not punching up. So serial killers get sensationalized in a different way, focusing on the grotesque and the perverted and the macabre. What can you say, it sells? And this was a lesson the press learned over 100 years ago with the first real serial killer in the United States, the American Ripper himself, HH Holmes. Alright, so here's the deal with this video. This video is sort of like a collaboration with myself. Collabing with myself. When researching this video, my fellow writer Ryan, who's done a fantastic job helping me out with this channel, he researched the heck out of this video and he found so much detail that we couldn't possibly fit into a video. So what we did was we created a huge blog post out of that. So if you want to get more detail on this story, if this video just kind of like whets your appetite and you want to get all the craziness involved, you can follow the link that's down in the description. It'll take you and you can find out so much more. Sicko. Alright, so let's start with the legend of H.H. Holmes and work our way backwards. H.H. Holmes was a businessman and small-time hustler in Chicago in the 1890s who had a 3-story hotel at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. It was a modest business, but the legend says that this was just a front. What he was really doing was creating a killing factory. He modified the room so that he could pump gas into the rooms to knock out his victims, and then he would dump them down secret chutes down to the basement where he would have them dismembered and disposed of. Sometimes he would drop bodies down that chute unconscious but still alive, so when the victim woke up, they were tied to a table where he would torture them for days before finishing them off. And he installed all this just before the Chicago World Columbian Exposition of 1893, when millions of people came and visited Chicago from all around the world. These were his perfect victims. People were much less connected back then. You couldn't trace people from their credit card purchases or their cell phone activity. Sometimes people just disappeared. And that's exactly what happened in Holmes' House of Horrors. People would check in and then vanish in the middle of the night. Never heard from again. And when the police finally caught on and searched this hotel, they found the burned bodies of hundreds of victims in the basement. Bodies in vats of acid, and an overall just absolute horror show. And Holmes became known as the American Ripper, the Devil of Chicago, and America's first serial killer. Yeah, that's the legend. It's pretty dramatic. The truth is way more convoluted and messy. He was much less of a monster and much more Walter White. But only in the bad ways, like the small-time hustler that was just smart enough to always kind of slither out of trouble, not the badass, say my name, Walter White. First of all, H.H. Holmes wasn't his real name. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. Herman was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, and though the legend says that he grew up torturing animals, his mother said that he actually loved animals, especially dogs. Another part of the legend is that Holmes grew up really awkward and couldn't look people in the eye, but the truth was he had something called a strabismus in his left eye, which causes a loss of muscle control. In fact, he was a charming conversationalist by most accounts. He married 3 women throughout his life. He was a compulsive womanizer, so, probably wasn't that awkward. He trained as a surgeon before he moved to Chicago in 1886, where he made his fortune running small con jobs around town, like renting out furniture and bikes under an assumed name and then selling them. And it was while running these small con jobs that he took on the pseudonym HH Holmes. When he spelled it out, he would sometimes say Henry Howard or just Harry H. Holmes. Having a fake name kind of helped him to skip out on bills. Holmes eventually scammed enough money that he was able to buy a drugstore in the Chicago neighborhood of Inglewood. The legend has it that he murdered the owners, but he probably just bought it. And across the street from that drugstore, he built a building that would later be known as the Murder Castle. And not because it was a castle for a bunch of crows. Murder of crows. A group of crows is called a murder of crows. It's a joke. The second floor of this building contained a baffling maze of hallways and rooms, doors that led nowhere, secret walls that opened up into secret rooms, and people later assumed that this was to confuse his victims so he could murder them outside of prying eyes. In fact, the rooms were given names like the Room of 3 Corpses and the Asphyxiation Chamber by the press. But it was probably just meant to confuse Repo Man. It was a place where he could hide all of his furniture and bikes that he was later selling so that nobody could find them. In fact, one of the tenants of the building once said that he saw rooms full of furniture that were just empty the next day. And the whole thing about the hundreds of victims that came from the World's Fair, apparently he didn't take in a single guest from the World's Fair. In fact, while the World's Fair was going on, he was actually living in a different part of town and only visited that building because there was a fire on the 3rd floor, which was probably an insurance scam. And this is actually the pattern with Holmes. He was much less of a genocidal monster and more of just a con man that was constantly juggling his scams. Which might not sound so bad, just a guy running some cons, a little scammer, bit of a shyster, you might say. It's not like he killed people, except he totally killed people. Like everything about H.H. Holmes, a number of his victims is wrapped up in legend and outright lies, some of which he told himself. He had a great sense about how to confuse people by telling the truth and lying at different times. But there are 9 victims that are canonical and definitely assumed to be from H.H. Holmes, 5 of which happened in the Murder Castle. But the murder that did Holmes in was a guy named Benjamin Petezel. He was actually an accomplice of Holmes, and they went in together on an insurance fraud scam. So what they were going to do was find a dead body and then fake Benjamin's death by passing off the dead body as his, and then collect the insurance money from it and give it to a widow that only appeared on paper, and of course it would go to Holmes, and he would split the money with Benjamin. Now, getting a dead body wasn't difficult for Holmes because he had some medical connections, but he decided that the best way to pass off a dead body as Benjamin Petezel's body would be for it to, actually be Benjamin Petezel's body. So, he killed him. Which had the added bonus of not having to split the money with anybody, so win-win. But in this case, the insurance company challenged the story that Benjamin was blown up in an accidental explosion. They investigated, and they wound up convicting Holmes of this murder, and he was hanged just 9 days before his 35th birthday. But when investigating Holmes, more murders and mysterious disappearances came to light, and a past that was full of manipulation and deception. The first victim that was definitely Holmes' work was a woman named Julia Connor. She worked at Holmes' drugstore in the jewelry department with her husband Ned, who was the jeweler, and he sometimes managed the store for Holmes. And the couple actually lived at Holmes' castle, and somewhere along the way, Julia and H.H. Holmes had an affair. This broke up their marriage. Ned ran away, leaving Julia there with her 6-year-old daughter Pearl. Now, by all accounts, Julia and Pearl were perfectly happy there, but around Christmas of 1891, they both disappeared. The castle's janitor, a guy named Pat Quinlan, had apparently told his family that they had moved off to California, but Pat was also known to be an accomplice of Holmes, so he might have been directed to say that. Regardless, after Holmes was arrested and police started looking through the castle, they actually dug up the remains of a 6-year-old girl in the basement. Holmes would later claim responsibility for Julia's death, but what he claimed was that he was trying to perform an abortion on her and she died on the operating table. Obviously, nobody knows what really happened. Why Pearl was killed is anybody's guess. Maybe she witnessed her mom's death. Maybe she was just a responsibility he didn't want to keep up with. But regardless, after a few weeks after they disappeared, he was actually renting out their room for other people, and it still had all their stuff in it. Yeah, according to the tenant that moved in, the room had women's clothes strewn all about, and apparently HH Holmes casually kicked a doll under the bed. The next murder attributed to Holmes was a woman named Emmeline Segrand. Just like Julia, she also worked for Holmes and eventually had a romantic relationship with him. Hey ladies, don't date this guy. When she disappeared in 1892, Holmes claimed that she had run off to get married. But one of the tenants of the hotel claimed the day after she was last seen, Holmes and Pat Quinlan were seen carrying out a large crate. He would later claim responsibility for her death, but he used the same excuse that he used for Julia, that she died in a botched abortion attempt. Set side by side, the murders of Julia, Pearl, and Emmeline look less like some sadistic killer that gets off on hurting people and more like somebody that just is a narcissist trying to get rid of his obligations. A narcissist with zero empathy, which is basically a psychopath. There are two more people who Holmes killed in his murder castle, a pair of sisters named Winnie and Nanny Williams, and these are kind of the most mysterious of all of his victims. Holmes had a gift for confusing things by sometimes confessing to crimes that he hadn't committed and denying crimes that he very clearly committed. And even though he very clearly killed Minnie and Nanny, he never claimed responsibility for it. According to his story, Minnie was actually a murderer. She and him were having an affair, and when Nanny came over, she flew into a jealous rage, hit Nanny over the head with a stool, and killed her. Holmes then helped her dispose of the body and then helped her to leave the country, according to Holmes. But both sisters disappeared at the exact same time. They were last seen on July 5th, 1893, and in the days that followed, Holmes made several purchases in Winnie's name, all of which, he made money on. So, he killed her. At this point, Holmes had a pretty impressive body count going, but believe it or not, we're not even at the crazy part yet. Because something I didn't mention before was that Holmes actually had two wives with two separate families while he was living in Chicago, and in 1894, things started getting a little hot around all of his insurance scams, so he had to leave them behind. He went from Chicago to Denver, where he collected some debt that was owed to Minnie Williams, and while he was there, he got married. Again. 3 marriages going on at this point. This one was named Georgiana Yoke, and she actually followed him from Denver to Fort Worth, where he got into trouble for stealing horses. Really, dude? He was chased out of town pretty quickly and learned the meaning of the phrase, "Don't mess with Texas." He bounced to St. Louis, where he had a chance to start a new drugstore business, but decided, hey, it's much better to just rip off your suppliers instead. But his old Chicago hustles didn't work out so well in St. Louis, so he was arrested and put in jail for a brief period of time, where he just couldn't help but brag to his cellmate about all of the insurance scams he was running. After he made bail, he rushed off to Philadelphia, now low on cash and desperate for a payday, and this is where he met up with his old friend, Ben Petzel. Remember Ben, the guy that was going to work with Holmes to fake his own death, and then Holmes just killed him? That's where this happened. Knocked him out with chloroform, then burned his body. But it actually gets way worse than this, because Ben actually had a wife and family. His wife's name was Carrie. He had a daughter named Alice that was 15, a daughter named Nellie that was 12, and a son named Howard that was 8. Carrie and possibly the children knew that there was this insurance scam going on, so when they identified the body, they thought it was the fake dead body. They had no idea that it was actually their father and husband. The insurance company cut Holmes a check for $10,000, and then he told Carrie that he would reunite her with Ben, but he didn't think that the kids should go along with him. He didn't think that they should get wrapped up in this scam, so he put them under the protection of a friend of his named Minnie Williams. Yeah, that Minnie Williams, who had been dead for a year at that point. What he actually did was move these kids around himself. He kept them separate from their mother while he shuttled them all around the country on a wild goose chase. Also, his wife Georgiana was with him, and she had no idea about any of this other stuff, so somehow he shuffled these people around on this insane route from Philly to Cincinnati to Indianapolis to Detroit, with stops in Toronto and Ogdensburg, New York. 3 different groups of people, none of which had any idea that the other people were involved in all this. Sometimes they were riding the same trains and even staying in the same hotels. Eventually, the children became too much for him to want to deal with, so he did what pretty much came naturally to him at this point. It's believed that Howard, the 8-year-old, was poisoned and then burned. Apparently, some of his teeth and chunks of his skull were found in the flue of a stove in a house that Holmes had rented along the way. And the bodies of Alice and Nellie were found buried in a shallow basement. Amazingly, during all this, he had time to go back to his hometown and visit his first wife, Clara, and his son, Robbie. And he told them that he had been in a railway accident and had been experiencing amnesia for the last 6 years, and they were so happy to see him, they were totally fine with the fact that he said that he married Georgiana because she was a nurse that was taking care of him. I mean, this guy. But Holmes's luck finally ran out. The insurance company that dealt with Ben Petezel's death challenged the original story. They hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who found a slew, just an entire trail of fraud and scam victims along the way, as well as a former cellmate that shared with them everything that Holmes had bragged about when he was in jail. From November 1894 to July 1895, fragments of the truth started popping up left and right, and Holmes was arrested, extradited to Philadelphia, where he faced charges for the murder of Ben Petezel. And all the craziness that they found in the Chicago castle started to come to light after an excavation order was done in July of 1895. Very quickly, the trickle of press interest turned into an absolute flood. Everything got blown completely out of proportion. Details became big mountains of evidence. Ashes that were found in the basement turned into hundreds of bodies. And in fact, they called one room the hanging room because they found a rope in it. Crowds flocked to the murder castle to see the place where all this stuff happened. In fact, in one day, 4,900 people showed up and had to be kept away by the police. But hundreds actually got into the castle and ransacked the place. But even after the Petezel children's bodies were found, the lawyer for HH Holmes convinced the judge to only let the evidence around Ben Petezel's death be involved in the case. 12 jurors convicted Holmes of killing Ben. All of his appeals were denied. And even as he was standing at the gallows, the only deaths he claimed responsibility for were Julia and Emmeline's from the botched surgeries. After his execution, the story and the legend of H.H. Holmes just spread even more. Hundreds of people were claimed to have been his victims from the World's Fair, when in fact probably hundreds of people just disappeared, because people just disappeared back then sometimes. Some people claimed Holmes faked his own death, and later on some actually said that he might have been Jack the Ripper before he moved to Chicago. One of the people who actually believes the Ripper story is Jeff Mudgett, the great-great-great-grandson of H.H. Holmes. And he actually had Holmes's body unearthed and did DNA tests on it to make sure that that was actually his body. It was. And by the way, this wasn't easy to do because Holmes insisted that a concrete dome be built over his grave so that people wouldn't desecrate it. Holmes today is remembered more for the crimes that he might have committed than the crimes that he actually committed, which is a shame because these are real people whose lives were destroyed, like dozens of them when you count the family members and everything. That's enough, isn't it? Holmes wasn't a supervillain, though it makes us feel better to think of him that way. If we can think of him as some supernaturally evil person, then we can convince ourselves that we're nothing like him. Labels kind of create a little bit of a distance there. He was a man who told lies with every other breath, who hated earning an honest buck when a crooked one would do, and he thought he was smarter than everybody, and that he would always get away with it. And like everybody else, he started small. Clara Lovering Mudgett, his first and only legal wife, once said to a criminologist that she had a hard time accepting that he did these things, saying, quote, "But of course he has worked himself up to it little by little, and I think, having done some little wrong, he had been driven to a greater one for a cover, and each one growing worse, of course it's more easy to go in the wrong after the first few steps." Regardless if he was more Walter White than Zodiac Killer, H.H. Holmes was the first serial killer to really capture the public consciousness. Sadly, he was not the last. As I said at the beginning of this video, there is a blog post with much more detail on all of this that's linked down in the description. I invite you to go check it out if you want more details, but tell me what you think. Do you think that H.H. Holmes was the supervillain? Did he have a murder castle? Did he murder hundreds of people? Was he Jack the Ripper? Tell me what you think in the comments. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is a little bit different from the kind of stuff that I normally do. I'm kind of liking to do the biography type stuff. This is definitely in a dark direction, but tell me what you think. All right, thanks for watching, you guys. Please do like and share this video if you liked it. And if this is your first time here, maybe check out this video. I do videos on more science-related topics and futurism. Every once in a while, I delve into some dark stuff, because we're dark people sometimes. But if you check out some of my other videos and you like them, I do invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. All right, with that, I'm going to let you go. Sleep tight, everyone, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Well, hi. Looks like the ugly stick got beaten with you. What? You didn't think you were Miss America, did you? Oh, that hurt your feelings? Oh. Sorry. It's not personal. I don't know any better. Hey, don't get mad at me. I'm a psychopath. I can't help it. See, if you get mad at me for hurting your feelings, then you're just intolerant of people with mental issues, and now I'm offended. I mean, would you get mad at a guy who had no legs if he didn't like carry you across, a pond or something? What, do you hate disabled people now? I mean, if you looked in the mirror, you're one to judge. No, I've got a card right here. Hang on. It's somewhere in here. Hey, would you mind getting me a drink while I'm looking at this? I'm not saying I'm allowed to do whatever I want. I'm just saying I can't control myself, and if you don't like it, well, that's your problem. Oh, can you validate my parking? No? We all like to think that people are getting worse over time, but psychopaths have actually been with us from the very beginning. I mean, according to the Bible, the third human ever murdered the fourth human ever. And we were off to the races. Theophrastus was one of Aristotle's students, and he may be one of the first people in history to really talk about psychopaths, which he called the unscrupulous, because they're just dadgum without scruples. Some examples of psychopaths in literature over the years include Medea from Greek mythology, King Shayar in the Book of the 1001 Nights, Richard III and Titus Andronicus from Shakespeare, Alex DeLarge in A Clockwork Orange, and Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Psychopathy comes from the words psych and pathy, psych meaning the soul or the mind, and pathy meaning suffering or disease. Psychopaths are basically people without any kind of conscience or empathy. It was first described in a psychiatric setting by one of psychiatry's founding fathers, Philippe Pinel. He called it mania sans Didier, and people with this he described as having certain behavioral deficits. Deficits such as antisocial acts, drug and alcohol abuse, willfully cruel, irresponsible, and immoral. And he believed that the difference between these people and the rest of society was that they suffered from what he called an absence of confusion in the intellect. But the word psychopath came from the German psychiatrist J.L.A. Koch in 1888. He actually called it psychopastiche. And he believed it was the constitution of a person at birth that created this condition. But in the early 20th century, the word psychopath was actually used to describe anybody with any kind of shyness or insecure behavior. It was kind of a placeholder term for anybody that wasn't completely normal. Kind of like the word hysteria applied to pretty much anything women did. But the term psychopathy became a little bit more codified in 1941 with the book The Mask of Sanity by Dr. Hervey Cleckley. The mask in the title refers to the projection of normalcy that psychopaths can put out there. It's kind of a seminal book on the subject, and it was based on a wide variety of studies on psychopaths out there in the world, and 50 years on, it's still considered one of the most influential works on the subject. But the first person to really put together a test to determine whether or not somebody was a psychopath was Dr. Robert Hare in 1980. It's known as the Hare by professionals, and it includes 20 different personality traits that can indicate whether or not somebody's a psychopath. And just in case you're wondering what they are, and if you want to check and make sure you're all right or anybody that you know, here's the list right here. Here's all 20 of them. I'm just going to let them kind of do their thing. And if you're watching that list and you're like, oh my God, that's my boyfriend, and that's my boyfriend, and that's my boyfriend, get out, girl. Get out. And by the way, there also is an extra interesting finding about psychopaths. They like bitter tasting foods. In a study published in the journal Appetite in 2016, researchers were able to show that, quote, participants confirmed the hypothesis that bitter taste preferences are positively associated with malevolent personality traits, with the most robust relation to everyday sadism and psychopathy. It was the overall strongest predictor compared to other taste preferences. And the participants who didn't like bitter taste tended to be more agreeable and cooperative and sympathetic. Yeah, so all those people drinking kale shakes out there, psychopaths. And it's thought that they prefer bitter taste because they have this need for stimulation. That's kind of something that's prevalent amongst psychopaths, is that their senses and their emotions are dulled, so they're always seeking stronger and stronger stimulations and risky behaviors and whatnot. And let's face it, few things are as thrilling as hurting other people. So what exactly causes someone to be a psychopath? Now, there has been some research that suggests that there's reduced brain activity in certain parts of the brain that have to do with emotion and decision making, like in the amygdala, which I covered in a recent video. This means they showed less activity and blood flow in those regions of the brain when they were showed images of people in distress or when they had to face the consequences of their actions. But this opens up a question, because we know about neuroplasticity in our brain. We know that our behaviors and our thinking patterns can actually change the way our brains are shaped. So, is it the shape of our brains that causes us to be psychopaths, or is it the fact that we're psychopaths that changes the structure in our brain? So one way to answer that is to look at identical twins and adopted children. And those studies seem to suggest that unemotional, psychotic behavior and thought patterns actually do have a genetic component to them. That those genes have more of an influence on someone than antisocial behavior itself. But when it comes to adopted children, those genes seem to be able to be counteracted by environmental and parental influences as well. Some recent research from Vanderbilt University seems to suggest that psychopaths are hardwired to seek reward at any cost. Like they have a hyper-reactive dopamine reward system that may be amplifying their behaviors. By the way, you might be wondering, what's the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath? Well, they're both considered antisocial personality disorders, but there are a few little differences. A sociopath disregards society's laws, morals, orders, and values and whatnot, and has purely selfish interests, but they don't go out with an intent to hurt others, they just want to do what pleases them. A psychopath disregards humanity entirely, intentionally chooses to hurt others, deliberately makes plans to use others that satisfy their personal goals, and to them, people are nothing more than just objects. One simple way of looking at it is that a sociopath is basically just unrestrained, whereas a psychopath is premeditative. So hearing those traits might give you the impression that all psychopaths are dangerous. This actually isn't true. Chances are you've worked for a psychopath because they are actually, because of their narcissistic tendencies, they're attracted to higher positions of power like CEOs or politicians. I mean, sure, you can make the argument that politics are dangerous, but when you think about a psychopath, you think Patrick Bateman, not so much Patrick Leahy. Which begs the question, how do you know if you're dealing with a psychopath? Well, here are some traits to look out for. Overconfidence, insincere, irresponsible, selfish, doesn't understand metaphors or abstract ideas but specializes in logic and reason, shallow emotions, uncaring, has a parasitic lifestyle, chaotic behavior, has a high threshold for disgust, and doesn't look at a person's eyes when that person's having an emotional moment. Now, you might be looking at that list and seeing that some of those things apply to you. So, does that mean you're a psychopath? No, unless you're a psychopath. Really, when testing these kinds of traits for psychopathy, it's not just about the traits themselves, it's really about more the intention behind those traits. Like somebody might have a little bit of narcissism or overconfidence, but that doesn't necessarily make them a psychopath. Now, if that is geared toward using other people for their benefit and not having any empathy for those people, well then, yeah, that you might be a psychopath. So is there any hope for somebody that's a psychopath? Can we change them in any way? Can you change yourself in any way if you're a psychopath? Or are you just destined to hurt other people for the rest of your life? Not necessarily. There are some studies being done at the Mendota Juvenile Treatment Center in Madison, Wisconsin that might give you a little bit of hope. On the youth psychopathy checklist, nearly all of the kids at the Mendota Treatment Center are tested as severe for potential psychopathy as adults. Psychopaths rarely give any kind of consideration to punishment. In fact, punishment tends to only harden their criminality. And psychopaths are 6 times more likely to commit more crimes after they leave prison. So the center decided to not focus on punishment so much, they kind of flipped the script and focused on positive reinforcement, what they call the decompression model. In the decompression model, signs of positive behavior, no matter what size, were reinforced with a reward, like candy bars or video games. And rewards could scale, meaning good behavior equals bigger prizes. So, did it work? Well, they studied 300 participants that were in the Mendota Treatment Center and then some that were treated in other places with different models. And of those, after 5 years, only 64% of the treatment center youth were arrested compared to 98% of the non-treatment youth. That's a 34% reduction in recidivism. The Mendota Center youth were 50% less likely to commit a violent crime. And the treatment center youth didn't commit any homicides compared to the non-treatment center youth who killed 16 people after their release. Yikes. So it appears there's a lot of importance and a lot of weight in identifying these traits in kids when they're young and being able to teach them tools to be able to work through those as they get older. Or to use a cliche, a carrot is more effective than a stick. You know, there's a lot of misinformation out there about psychopathy. Just because somebody is, defined as a psychopath does not necessarily mean that they're going to be violent. Most people want to do the right thing, even if they don't know what that right thing is. But still, if you think that somebody that you work with or somebody that you're involved with in some way might be a psychopath, you might want to keep your guard up. Just saying. So what do you think? Do you know anybody in your life that could be defined as a psychopath? Have you had any experiences with them? Got any crazy stories to tell? Share it down in the comments below. All right, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, Google thinks you might like this one too, so you might want to check that one out or look at any of the videos down here on the side that have my face on it. And if you like them and you enjoy them, I invite you to subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. All right, with that, I thank you for watching. You guys go out, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. All right, real quick before we get to the next video, I'm gonna pull a sneaky and make a fairly big announcement. Yes, I'm about to announce something for the first time, and I'm gonna bury it in the middle of a long-ass compilation video during the skip over parts. Because let's face it, if you're watching this far in on the first day, you're probably a super fan, and you deserve a nice surprise. So people who've been watching this channel for a long time and watching closely have heard me talk a lot about a huge project I've been working on for a while now. Some Patreon members and supporters have actually seen a little bit of this in the live streams and the Zoom calls and stuff. This project that I keep teasing, it just kind of started as a big YouTube video that I was going to do, but over time it grew and it grew, and now it's basically a feature-length documentary. And the idea behind this documentary was simply, would it be possible to stand on the oldest and newest rocks on planet Earth? That was the conceit behind it. And it turns out, yes, it is possible. So I did it. So my team and I spent the next 4 years, yes, I've been working for 4 years on this project, planning and traveling to an isolated rock outcrop in far north Arctic Canada that has survived for 4.02 billion years. We were joined by geologists from the Smithsonian Institution, and they guided us through the story of these rocks and what they say about the earliest Earth.
Every time you look at a rock, you're seeing a different planet. A planet that used to exist and no longer does.
We also spoke to tribal leaders from the First Nations people who had been on this land for thousands of years, and we heard about the importance of their place names, and hundreds and hundreds of ancient place names, and how important that is to their culture.
Our landscape holds probably the oldest rock in the world. Almost every step we make, there was a story.
And then we traveled to the big island of Hawaii, arguably the youngest landmass in the world, to talk to USGS geologists about Kilauea and the process of eruption and renewal that is just constantly remaking that landscape. So the whole thing in this video is that I'm like going and trying to see like the newest rock.
That's one of them.
This is one of the newest rocks on planet Earth. There we are. We did it, guys! Let's go home! And we put all of this together in a massive, almost 2-hour documentary, cleverly titled The Oldest and Newest Places on Earth. And it is finally being released in December on Nebula. It will eventually be released to YouTube, but Nebula collaborated to help make this happen. It wouldn't exist without them, so it's going to live there for a while first. But even once it's out on YouTube, there's going to be a ton of extra content on Nebula. All the interviews are going to be released in full on there. I think there's 7 interviews that we had with a lot of interesting stuff in it that didn't wind up in the rest of the documentary. There's also a lot of stuff that was really interesting. We wanted to keep in the video, but because of time, they got cut. All of these scenes will be extra in living on Nebula. And obviously watching it on Nebula means no ads, no sponsor messages, just the clean, unadulterated experience. So if you haven't joined the party over at Nebula yet, this is a very good reason to do so, but let me give you some more good reasons. I post all my videos there, completely ad-free, usually earlier than on YouTube, and usually with extra sections that are just for the Nebula people. So like you'll never miss any of the videos if you watch them over on Nebula, because there's no algorithm there. There's nothing there to tell you what to watch. You just follow who you like and you get to see what they make. It's an idea whose time has come. Again, I swear every single post that I make, I get a comment from someone that's like, "Hey, glad you're back, missed your videos." And I'm like, "Thanks, but I've never gone anywhere." Yeah, on Nebula, if you follow someone, you'll get to see them. Every one of their videos. What a concept. And don't even get me started on the fact that I can talk like an adult on there without getting demonetized. You might have noticed how much stuff in this compilation has been bleeped and fuzzed out because they keep getting demonetized. These compilations do. For things that were not a problem years ago when those videos were made. Sorry, it's unbelievable. And of course, everything that I just said applies not to just me, but to hundreds of other thoughtful, great creators and filmmakers. Nebula is the place where we get to be our authentic selves, and we get to take risks, some of which are Nebula originals that you can't find anywhere else. I could promote an upcoming anthology series, Subliminal, which yours truly got to direct an episode. You'll be hearing a lot more about that soon. By the way, if you've got some extra funds burning a hole in your pocket, Nebula is offering a lifetime subscription. It's normally $500, but if you use my link below, it's only $300. Anyway, a lot of big things are about to drop over on Nebula, and if you've ever considered signing up, now is the time. Especially since they are offering viewers this channel 40% off the annual subscription, bringing it to $36 for a whole year. That's like $3 a month. It's like a cup of coffee. So don't miss out. A lot of cool stuff is coming over to Nebula, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of it. And I can't wait for you guys to see this video. Movie. It's a movie, really. Anyway, just scan this here QR code or hit the link in the description below. So now let's go back in time to a couple of historical events that may have been the inspirations for both Batman and Dracula. On May 31st of 2014, three 12-year-old girls entered the woods outside of Waukesha, Wisconsin to play a game of hide and seek. Nothing unusual about that. Kids play hide and seek all the time. What was different about this game was that it ended with two of the girls stabbing the third girl 19 times. This wasn't the agreed upon punishment for losing the game. No, this was their attempt to appease Slender Man. Slender Man was a creepypasta that first showed up on the website Something Awful that became really popular, eventually became a bit of an online urban legend. There were movies and video games made about it and everything. And yeah, I don't know, for whatever reason, these two girls believed that by killing their friend, they would get the approval of Slender Man. It sparked a whole series of debates about the internet and the dangers of giving impressionable kids access to everything on it that now has totally been resolved. No, it hasn't. Slender Man, of course, is nowhere near the first urban legend. While the internet may have made it possible for urban legends to spread a lot more quickly, urban legends have been around as long as urban areas have been around. But there is one that is considered the first urban legend, and it was called Spring-Heeled Jack. And it was a real person, supposedly, but his influence can still be seen in pop culture today. To understand the origin of Spring-Heeled Jack, we kind of have to start by talking about the Victorian era, specifically what was going on in jolly old London, Nailed it. The Victorian age refers to the reign of Queen Victoria of England, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. And if there was one word that sums up the Victorian era, it's change. It was a period of profound change and profound social repression, but we'll get to that later. But no, I've argued before that I think maybe the 1800s might have been the most transformative century in all of human history, in the sense that, like, somebody living in 1801 was basically living the same way as their ancestors had for the last 1,000 years. By 1901, there were cars on the road, and most people lived in cities and worked in factories. That's a very simplistic version of that argument, but the point is that advances in technology changed communication and transportation in ways that we had never seen before. And the worldwide epicenter of all that change was in London. London's population rose from 1.9 million in 1801 to 6.2 million in 1897, spurred on by innovations like sewer systems and subways and electricity. But Victorian London was also kind of a nightmare. Class division was baked into Victorian society, and nowhere was that more on display than London. If you were one of the have-nots, you stayed one of the have-nots for the entirety of your life. Luckily, lifespans were incredibly short. People lived packed into squalid tenements, the streets were caked with manure and trash, infectious disease rampaged the population, and smoke from chimneys and coal plants was choking. Just read any Charles Dickens book, he didn't make that stuff up, folks. Plus, it was the fact that there was all this new technology and a lot of it wasn't really understood. Lead and arsenic was used in all kinds of household products. Mercury poisoning was common. I mean, I could do a whole video about how everything in the Victorian era wanted to kill you. But maybe because there was so much changing so fast, the Victorian society became extremely socially repressive, sort of as a backlash to it, as a way to preserve the traditions that, had made them who they were. And of course, these traditions mostly benefited the upper classes. Victorians were obsessed with class structures and created complicated rules around it. Like, just interacting with anybody was a social minefield. Like, you could not approach somebody to speak to them in any way that was in a higher station than you. Like, you could go to jail for that. And women were particularly controlled to where you could go, who you could talk to, how you drank your tea. Pretty much every decision you made was predetermined for you. But men, on the other hand, were literally expected to die as opposed to breaking a social norm. The whole women and children on the lifeboats thing. The sense of helplessness that comes with being stuck in a rigid class system that's pretty much a death sentence if you're below a certain point, in a city filled with smoke and narrow alleyways riddled with crime, was a recipe for some really interesting chaos to happen. And in September of 1837, one particular bit of chaos sprang out of the dark streets of London. Quite literally. A woman named Polly Adams was leaving a bar called the Green Man with some friends, and as they were walking through the Blackheath district, a black-cloaked figure jumped out of the shadows and attacked them. Supposedly, he smelled of sulfur and spit blue fire at the group. He then leapt toward Polly and began to, tear at her clothes with these metal-clawed hands, and her friends ran away, terrified. Friends. And then, pretty much without warning, he just stopped and ran away into the night, laughing, leaving her laying there, tattered and bloody with scratches across her abdomen. Just a random attack from a weird guy. A month later, the same person /creature/demon attacked another woman, this one named Mary Stevens. Mary worked as a servant in Lavender Hill, south of the Thames, and as she was leaving her parents' house, walking back to her job, she passed through a park called Clapham Commons. And as she was exiting the park, this same cloaked figure jumped out of the darkness, shot blue flame out of his face, and began to tear at her with these metal claws. But unlike Polly, he sort of sexually attacked her. He began kissing all over her. Mary screamed at the top of her lungs, apparently loud enough to get the attention of other people, and this guy let her go and ran off into the night, again, laughing. But it was the next sighting that earned this mystery man his iconic name. According to the story, a carriage was passing through the London streets when this same dark-cloaked man jumped in front of the carriage and scared the horses so bad that it tipped over. The driver of the carriage chased after this man, who was cackling with laughter, but as he got close to him, apparently this man jumped clear over a 9-foot fence. And that is how this weird, creepy dude earned the name Spring-Heeled Jack. Now, did this guy actually have some kind of spring device in his shoes that allowed him to jump over high walls? Did he have some kind of rope device? Were there rockets that hadn't been invented yet? Or was he just the world's first parkour artist?
Parkour! Parkour!
I mean, granted, the driver said that he leapt it in a single bound, but people's memories can be sketchy. In fact, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson law of arousal that states that at low and high anxiety levels, our memories are pretty sketchy. It's kind of somewhere in the middle, where we're having middle levels of anxiety, that our memories lock in a lot better. So, in this case, maybe he didn't actually clear it in one jump. Maybe the wall wasn't actually 9 feet high. There may have been some embellishments there. Not to mention it was dark and foggy, but regardless of the details, with this one jump, an urban legend was born. Headlines swept the newspapers of this dark figure attacking women and causing panic in the streets of London. 3 months after the attacks, the Lord Mayor of London, John Cowan, received an anonymous letter claiming that the Spring-Heeled Jack attacks were actually pranks by the aristocrats of London. This becomes very important later on. And that same mayor in January the next year showed off a pile of letters that he had received from various people claiming to have been attacked by Spring-Heeled Jack. Which all or most of these accounts claim that Jack had red glowing eyes, clawed metal hands, the ability to jump really high, and always managed to get away. Now, because most of these claims weren't verified by police or medical reports or anything like that, they aren't really considered canon. But the next one very much was. The woman's name was Jane Alsop, and as the story goes, she was sitting at home when somebody knocked on the door, so she opened the door. Remember how we used to open doors? And outside was a man claiming that he had found Spring-Heeled Jack and needed a candle to see. So she obliged, but as she approached to give him a candle, the man apparently pulled up his cloak and shot, again, blue flame at her face. She described him as wearing a large helmet, a white oilskin clothing, and red eyes that glowed with fire. Which I have to say is really handy when you need to light a candle. After he stunned her with the blue flame, he leaped on top of her, began scratching at her with the metal claws, and then pulled her out onto the stoop. Unfortunately for Jane, this attack seems to have been a lot more vicious than the other ones. He did manage to scratch her pretty deeply on the abdomen and on the neck, and she lost large patches of hair as well. Luckily, her dad rushed to the scene and scared the guy away. Now, what was unique about this attack, outside of it being especially vicious, is that Jane was a member of the upper class. And because this was Victorian London and class means everything, now it was something to take seriously. The Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, went out into the London night stating that he would track down Spring-Heeled Jack after hearing about Jane's attack. This 70-year-old man patrolled the streets at night with a rifle in hand for weeks, but was never able to catch the fiend. Shortly after the Jane Alsop attack, probably while the Iron Duke was off somewhere else in the city, a woman named Lucy Scales and her sister were passing through the Green Dragon alley when a man dressed as a policeman approached them with a lantern in hand. And just as Jane began to speak to him, he shot the famous blue flame into her face. But this freaked her out so much that she had a seizure. And maybe because he was satisfied with what he had done, or maybe because he was freaked out by the seizure, the man just kind of ran away. Newspapers were filled with reports of his attacks, and lurid tales of his exploits filled the penny dreadfuls, which were kind of like Pulp Fiction magazines of their day. And there were theater performances, Punch and Judy puppet shows, and preachers declaring that Spring-Heeled Jack was a demon punishing London for its wicked ways. And then Jack went silent for a while. Maybe things just got a little too hot for him. Maybe he had achieved his goals of panic in the streets, agent of chaos as it were. Or maybe he stopped leaving his victims alive. Jack sprang up again in 1843 in Northamptonshire, earning him a new nickname, Travelin' Jack. Actually, that's not true, but that would have been awesome. The reports at the time claimed to see him jumping from rooftop to rooftop, quote, looking like the devil himself. In 1847, he popped up in Teignmouth, Devon, which was also related to the phenomenon of the devil's footprints that showed up in Devon in 1855. Some interesting Jack-related action occurred in Lincolnshire, where he was apparently shot at while jumping across rooftops, and apparently the bullets just kind of ricocheted off of him with a metallic sound. He even attacked a military base in Aldershot in Surrey County, where he would apparently sneak up on soldiers and slap them when they weren't looking. Apparently he did it one time with a fish. Later stories would be attributed to him, like a report in the News of the World in November of 1872 of the Peckham Ghost, claiming it was none other than Spring-Heeled Jack, who terrified a past generation. Similar stories published in the Illustrated Police News in April and May of 1873 reported sightings in Sheffield of the Park Ghost, which locals attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack. The last reported Jack sighting occurred in Liverpool in 1904. Witnesses reported seeing a guy bounding down the street before jumping up onto the rooftops and leaping away forever. And with that, Spring-Heeled Jack's reign of terror was over. Now, outside of a supernatural explanation, demons, aliens, and the like, it's probably unlikely that Spring-Heeled Jack was one guy doing all those things. I mean, that would have been a pretty spry 80-year-old in 1904. The most accepted theory is that everything following the original London attacks in the 1830s were just copycats and urban legends. Victorian creepypasta, if you will. But there were several real people that were really attacked and injured by someone. And after 150 years, that someone remains a mystery. But there are some theories and clues that lead to some interesting speculation. For example, many people claim that he smelled like sulfur. Now, to the people at the time, that was just proof that he was the devil or a demon from hell. But, interesting thing about sulfur, it burns blue. And a blue flame was one of Jack's calling cards. It could be possible he was blowing sulfur dust out of his hand or through some kind of device in his mouth that ignited it. So, some speculate that he might have been an educated man or had some kind of advanced knowledge of chemistry. Of course, back in those days, only the upper classes had access to advanced education, and Spring-Heeled Jack was known to wear fine clothes. And if you remember, the mayor did get that anonymous letter claiming that Spring-Heeled Jack was just a prank by the elite aristocrats of London. Given the severity of the attacks, one would assume that this was a particularly sadistic aristocrat. And there was one guy that kind of fit that bill. He was the Marquess of Waterford. Yeah, this guy was a real piece of work. He kind of lucked into his position due to some deaths in his family, if you want to call that luck. But maybe because of the childhood trauma that was associated with that, he kind of became a cruel and sadistic monster. He was known to just kind of turn over apple carts as he was walking through town, and he would start fights just to start fights, and would sometimes even get into the fights with the officers that came to break up the fights. He was a drunkard that would just walk around in a drunken state trying to pick fights with people everywhere he went. He would even pay people to fight him. There was a story about how one time he abused a bunch of Glee singers while naked, which, if you've seen the show Glee, I mean, it's kind of understandable. And I think he's actually where the term paint the town red came from, because there was an incident where he and some fellow douchebag lords got super drunk, started a little mini riot in town, and went through breaking windows and stealing door knockers off of doors and whatnot, and stole some red paint and just painted a bunch of stuff. And because they were so respectful of the legal system there, when they showed up for court, they were wearing bearskins. He was in the upper class of Victorian London, which meant he was pretty much untouchable. And he loved to spread chaos wherever he went and had no qualms about hurting people. There is one small problem with this theory, though. He only had one leg. Apparently one time he commissioned a new yacht, and when he received it, he and his buds were having some fun and celebrating and, blowing off cannons like you do. And one of those cannons blew off his leg. Seriously, no matter how rich you are, you can still be a redneck. Anyway, kind of hard to leap tall fences in a single bound when you only have one leg, although it could have been one of his douchebag friends that was doing it. Long story short, he's been speculated as a culprit for Spring-Heeled Jack for a long time, but there's never really been any proof of it. There was, however, one person that was convicted of a couple of Spring-Heeled Jack attacks. In July 1847, an investigation into the attacks in Teignmouth, Devon that I was talking about earlier, led to a guy getting convicted of 2 charges of assault against women. Be this man a copycat or not, he did fit the bill. He had a skin coat that, quote, had the appearance of a bullock's hide, along with a skull cap and a mask with horns. The name of the man was Captain Finch, and he was described as, quote, a man of alleged ill health and apparently 60 years of age, about the last person that could have been suspected. Despite that, and despite the fact that the judge had reservations about accusing an old soldier of assaulting women, he was found guilty on 2 counts, but he was charged 17 shillings each, which was a total slap on the wrist. Regardless of anything, he was one of the copycats. The original Spring-Heeled Jack has never been found. The Spring-Heeled Jack frenzy is mostly forgotten these days. He was considered more of a prankster than a monster like the serial killers that would follow, like Jack the Ripper. He's been so mythologized through the Penny Dreadfuls over the years that it's kind of difficult to separate myth from reality. And in fact, paradoxically, he kind of became a bit of a superhero over time. One popular Penny Dreadful author named Alfred Barrage, who wrote under the name A.M. Barrage, kind of leaned into the whole idea of Spring Heel Jack as an aristocrat who did this stuff at night, but he put a little bit of a twist on it, and instead of making him somebody that was out terrorizing the good people of London, he was out terrorizing the criminals and the evildoers. He became a dark vigilante, the Avenger of the Night, who used his vast wealth to construct an underground lair where he used his technological skills to create weapons that he would use to defeat the bad guys. Sound familiar at all? Now, there have been a lot of characters that fit into the trope of the wealthy guy who uses his resources to help out the little man, but very few of them were illustrated dressed like a bat. Now, there's no way to know exactly how much Spring-Heeled Jack may have influenced Bob Kane when he created Batman, but it's an interesting thought that you could tie all of the iterations of Batman through the years, all the way back through these pulpy Penny Dreadfuls to this one weird Victorian guy that had a thing for sulfur. And I know I, for one, can't wait for Christopher Nolan's Dark Jack trilogy. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. This is Salem, Massachusetts, which famously got caught up in a witch craze in 1692 that led to the executions of 19 people. It was a society gone mad, overcome by fear and suspicion. And it's not the last time this happened. In fact, 200 years later, in 1892, you get the story of Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown was the unassuming daughter of George Brown, a Rhode Island farmer whose life had just been through a series of tragedies. Tuberculosis had been ravaging the area, they called it consumption at the time, and in this outbreak, George lost his wife Mary, his daughter Mary Olive Brown, and yeah, in the same year, Mercy Brown herself died of the illness. And even as he was burying Mercy, his son Edwin became sick. But if Mercy's life had been unassuming, her death would be nothing of the sort. Because 2 months later, a mob of people from the nearby town of Exeter dug up Mercy's body, pulled out her heart, and set it on fire. Mercy unfortunately got caught up in another Salem witch trial-like event that took place in New England in the late 1800s. Only this time they didn't think that Mercy was a witch. They thought she was a vampire. So just to put this time period into perspective, this was the 1890s. This was the Gilded Age. We had light bulbs and telephones, transatlantic steamships. Mercedes had its first car on the road at this point. We even had the germ theory of medicine, though it was still in its early days and hadn't been universally adopted in some rural areas. You know, the old folk remedies and superstitions held sway. And yeah, rural New England was one of those places. By the way, Mercy Brown was not an isolated event. Another story involves Rachel Harris of Manchester, Vermont. This was about 100 years earlier in 1790, but Rachel died of tuberculosis. Her husband then married her stepsister, Hilda, who also started to show signs of TB. And yeah, the local townspeople thought that it was Rachel's fault, that she was escaping her grave at night and enacting revenge on her stepsister. So they exhumed Rachel's corpse in February of 1793. They removed her heart, liver, and lungs and burned them on a blacksmith's forge. This was a big event, by the way. Like 500 people showed up to take part in this. Although, I don't know, in fairness, there probably wasn't a whole lot to do in 1793 Vermont. Regardless, despite their valiant efforts, it didn't stop Hulda from dying in September of that year. So yeah, this was a real thing. People were convinced that vampires existed and were preying on the living. But these weren't exactly the vampires that we think of today. You know, today we've seen vampires in any conceivable way possible, from Count Dracula to Edward Cullen from Twilight to Grandpa Munster. But all vampires in fiction have a few core characteristics in common. They drink human blood, they can turn their victims into vampires, they prey on their victims at night because the sun kills them, they have hypnotic powers, and they can't see their images in mirrors and have no shadows. Of course, a lot of what we think of now as a vampire was kind of popularized first by Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula in 1897. He was the first person to take all of these sort of folk stories about vampires and sort of codify them in a way. It's thought that he named the character Dracula after Vlad III, who ruled an area of modern-day Romania called Wallachia from 1456 to 1462. His father was Vlad II, who went by Vlad Dracul, meaning Vlad the Dragon, so Vlad III was called Dracula. He was also called Vlad the Impaler because he got a kick out of, impaling his enemies on wooden stakes. It was also said that he enjoyed dining amongst his dying victims and would dip his bread in their blood, which is horrifying and really unsanitary. Another historical figure that may have inspired Bram Stoker is a Hungarian countess named Elizabeth Bathory. Yeah, if you've never heard of Elizabeth Bathory, it's probably because she killed everyone who met her. It's rumored that she tortured and murdered more than 600 young women during the 16th and 17th centuries, and she would even bathe in the victim's blood. Again, guys, pathogens, jeez. It should be noted that these accusations may have been politically motivated and completely untrue, but they did feed into beliefs that people already had about monsters drinking the blood of others. So these stories go all the way back to the Middle Ages as plagues began to spread throughout Europe. You know, people didn't know what was going on. They often turned to folk tales and supernatural stuff to explain it. Like, for example, some of the victims of the plague had mouth lesions that bled, and yeah, some thought that their mouths were bloody because they'd been, drinking other people's blood. The point is, there are a few diseases that historians think are related to vampire stories. The first one is rabies. In 1998, neurologist Juan Gomez Alonso published a paper in Neurology that argued that the symptoms of rabies might explain vampire myths. Rabies lyssavirus causes rabies in animals. It's transmitted through direct contact with saliva or brain nervous tissue from an infected animal. And yet, rabies affects the central nervous system. Once it reaches the brain, it can cause things like agitation, anxiety, confusion, hallucinations even, before eventually killing the victim. Yeah, have you ever actually looked into rabies? Rabies sucks. And people with rabies go rabid. They bite and scratch and claw at people like a wild animal. Seeing a person do that might put some ideas in your head. The article also mentions that people who die from rabies often die from suffocation or cardiorespiratory arrest. This apparently can make the blood less likely to coagulate and hinder the composition, which might lead some people to think that the dead person is looking more undead than dead. He also pointed out some correlations in rabies outbreaks and the birth of vampire tales in the 1720s in Eastern Europe. In fact, one physician in 1733 got closer than he thought when he described vampires as, quote, a contagious illness more or less the same nature as that which comes from the bite of a rabid dog. But another contender is porphyria. So rabies may explain the biting and scratching parts of vampire lore, but other characteristics could be explained by a blood condition called porphyria. For people with porphyria, their bodies have trouble making heme, which is an essential part of hemoglobin. That's what carries oxygen around in our blood. And there are two broad types of porphyria. There's acute porphyria, which affect the nervous system, and cutaneous porphyrias that affect the skin. The most common type of acute porphyria is acute intermittent porphyria, which causes sudden and painful attacks. These attacks may include seizures, breathing problems, and red or brown urine, which one might expect one's urine to look like if you were drinking a lot of blood. And these attacks are often set off by triggers including stress, medications, and sunlight. Now, similarly, the skin porphyria is also set off by sunlight. It can cause blisters and excessive hair growth. Porphyria cutanea tarda, or PET, is the most common form of cutaneous porphyrias. It's characterized by extreme sensitivity to sunlight. If exposed to sunlight, people with PET might experience, again, skin blisters, excessive hair growth, or red or brown urine. So they're burned by sunlight, they only come out at night, and they have red pee. Like they've guzzled so much blood that they're just peeing red. And to tack on top of that, one of the treatments for porphyria was to drink animal blood. And people have even speculated that repeated porphyria attacks may cause facial disfigurement and gums to recede, kind of leading to the teeth having a fanged look. Oh, and believe it or not, garlic has a high sulfur content, and that can make it a potential trigger for a porphyria attack. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting connections there, and I definitely could see people mistaking that disease for vampirism, but I don't think that that's where it all came from. Yeah, porphyria is a very rare disease, so I find it kind of unlikely that all the vampire myths came from the very few people walking around with that, but I could totally see how somebody back then might have had their belief reinforced by seeing somebody that has porphyria. But the disease that's most associated with vampires is tuberculosis. Yeah, TB is especially associated with the New England vampire beliefs in the 18th and 19th centuries. A bacteria called Mycobacterium tuberculosis causes TB, which destroys lung tissue and can be fatal if not treated properly. People who experience untreated TB lose weight, become weak, have fevers, and can cough up blood. It basically makes a person look like their blood is being slowly drained out of their bodies, like they wake up every morning a little bit paler than the day before, like something is taking it from them in the middle of the night. TB can also be spread from person to person through the air. It's airborne, but most people back then didn't understand how that worked. So it's no wonder that they might have thought that a supernatural creature was sucking the life out of those dying from TB. And usually that creature was somebody who had recently died. While we're at it real quick, there are a few other supernatural myths that we may have a disease to thank for that. Like werewolves may have been inspired by rabies for all the reasons I listed before. There's also a condition called lycanthropy that makes people hallucinate that they're four-legged animals. There's also hypertrichosis, which in some cases causes hair to grow all over a person's body, giving them a sort of a teen wolf flavor. Witches are sometimes associated with ergot poisoning, which is a wheat fungus that can cause manic episodes and hallucinations. But in the case of the vampire craze of the 18th and 19th centuries in New England, it was tuberculosis. It was totally tuberculosis. A disease that so appears to consume the body that they actually called it consumption. It's easy to see why someone might expect that something else is consuming the body. Maybe somebody who just died. Someone like Mercy Brown. As tuberculosis ravaged nearby Exeter, the townspeople began to suspect things, maybe out of desperation. They just started looking for patterns. And while everybody had suffered during this outbreak, maybe none more so than George Brown, who had lost his wife, his 2 daughters, and now his only son was sick. I can only imagine that by the time these townspeople showed up with their shovels, intent on digging up his family, George was just too exhausted to say no. They dug up his wife Mary and his older daughter Mary Olive, but they had deteriorated to the point that they decided that it couldn't possibly be them. But Mercy, who had only been in the ground for 2 months, in the winter no less, looked remarkably fresh. In fact, her hair and nails seemed to have grown a little bit and blood still pooled in her body. So they did the thing that the folk tales said to do. They took out her heart, burned it, and then mixed the ashes into a potion for Edwin to drink. This would hopefully cure him of the vampire curse. It didn't. He died a few months later. The Mercy Brown story did make some headlines, though, and in fact, clippings of these stories and these articles were found in Bram Stoker's files after he died, so he did know about it. May have even been inspired by it. The vampire panic started to die down in the early 20th century when, medical knowledge improved and tuberculosis became treatable with antibiotics. In fact, Mercy Brown is thought to be the very last confirmed vampire in America. Today, her gravesite is a tourist attraction. Visitors to the grave may leave gifts behind like jewelry and flowers. Or in one case, a note that simply read, "You go, girl." All right, gang, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Please stay safe, and I will see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. It still blows my mind that the vampire craze took place as late as it did. Like, it was the late 1800s. Like, my great-grandpa was probably around for some of that. Mind-blowing. What they didn't have back then was the internet, which, let's just be honest, that's much scarier. I don't have any control over that, but I do have control over one tiny part of the internet, and that is LaughSmarter.com. Come, join us in the happy corner of the internet. So I've sold merch on this channel for almost 10 years now. You can see the videos in the compilation. I'm always wearing these shirts, like the one I'm wearing right now, and they've always been for sale. I haven't always promoted it very much, though. Merch sales was always just kind of like a little side thing on the channel. It really wasn't like a major source of revenue. We always got most of our income from like YouTube ads or sponsor reads. And the problem with that is that it varies, right? It fluctuates. The algorithm changes, audiences change, views go up and down, and I don't really have a whole lot of control over that unless I, completely change the topics and format of my videos. And I don't think any of you follow me because you want to see me chasing trends. Which is why you might have noticed over the last year or so that I've been promoting the merch a lot more than previously. We started a whole new merch brand and a website with it, LaughSmarter.com. We've been adding designs. We've been doing exclusive drops. We've been listening to you guys and making merch based off of your suggestions. And dare I say, we've been having a lot of fun with it. So the upside of leaning into merch is that it's something that we do actually have some kind of control over, right? It helps kind of smooth out the peaks and the valleys of the YouTube life. And, it allows me to pay my team and keep doing the kind of stuff that you guys want to see me do and do bigger and better stuff for that matter. And it's reciprocal, right? You guys aren't just giving me money for nothing. You're getting something in return and everybody's happy. So to everybody who has bought something from LaughSmarter.com over the last year, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It means so much. And if you haven't actually checked it out yet, I humbly invite you to go to LaughSmarter.com or just scan the QR code somewhere on the screen here. And you can go find out what's going on there. And you might find something that you want. Anyway, quick plug. Now let's talk about the silent twins of England. Little girls are creepy. All kids are monsters, but little boys, they just destroy your house, they just break everything in sight. Little girls are plotting something. There's deep, deep evil there. And the only thing creepier than a little girl? 2 little girls. When Kubrick wanted to turn up the creepy in Shining, what did he turn to? Twin girls. And he had Jack Nicholson standing next to him. With Halloween right around the corner, I wanted to focus on some creepy true stories, and no true story has creeped me out possibly more than the story of Jennifer and June Gibbons, also known as the Silent Twins. Two girls born 10 minutes apart whose obsession with each other grew over time into madness, crime, and death. Born in 1963 in England, June and Jennifer Gibbons were born to a Barbadian father who was a pilot for the Royal Air Force. They both had a speech impediment, and it took them a long time to start speaking, but when they did, they kind of spoke only to each other, and they only spoke in their own language. They had a rough time in school. They were silent, they were twins, they were black in a school with no other black kids in it, so they were bullied a lot, and the teachers didn't know what to do with them. They actually were allowed to go home early because they were bullied so badly. There is actually a term for language that only twins use with each other. It's called cryptophagia. Their weird behavior got the attention of the child counselors in their school, who called them selective mutes, and some even thought that their language that they spoke was some kind of primitive African click language. The twins were just incredibly withdrawn. They wouldn't look anybody in the eye, they wouldn't talk to anybody else, they would only communicate through writing, and even weirder, they kind of coordinated their movements. They would do things at the same time. They were always in lockstep at all times. They were just obsessed with their twinship. Unable to do anything with them, the school sent them to a special school called Eastgate Center for Special Education when they were 14 years old. And here they were studied extensively, and they actually found out that this secret language that they had was actually just English, but it was with a lot of their speech impediment and sped up. As they became teenagers, they became more and more withdrawn. They refused to even speak to their family. They kind of just lived in their room together, and they withdrew into sort of an imaginary world that they created. They both wrote novels. They created imaginary characters in their room. They just kind of had this little spot, and they stayed there. As they got a little bit older, they decided that they didn't want to be twins anymore. They didn't want to be together all the time. They decided they want to be individuals, as people tend to do when they become teenagers. So the school actually separated them, and this did not go well. The school gave them an option to send one of them to a different school and separate them completely, but they wanted to let the girls decide who was going to go away, and this led to them screaming and yelling at each other, which was something nobody had ever seen before. To try to create just a little separation anyway, the school divided them up into different rooms, and this didn't go so well either. In fact, they would find June catatonic on her bed, not even changing clothes, not even using the bathroom, refusing to talk to anybody, crying so much that snot and tears were just flowing to the floor. Eventually they left Eastgate and basically just went back home to their parents, where they locked themselves into their rooms and watched the world through binoculars out the window. And the more time they spent together, the more they began to hate each other. They wrote obsessively in their journals, and often in their journals they wrote about how much they hate each other and how much they wanted to hurt each other. Their twinship had become something of a prison. After about 2 years of this, they were 18 years old, and they decided that it was time to get out and see the world a little bit. And there were a couple of boys that they had become enamored with when they were at Eastgate, so they sought these boys out. Problem was, these boys were kind of troublemakers. They were from America. It's not why they were troublemakers, but they were from America. And they had been involved in robberies and arson, but these girls liked them and they showed them some attention that they never had before. So they had this whirlwind summer, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the whole thing, and things kind of spiraled out of control. All those years of silence and withdrawal came out in one big explosive summer. Now that they were social and they were, involved with these boys, their rivalry became physical. At one point, June tried to choke Jennifer with a radio wire, and Jennifer tried to drown June in a river. But things really fell apart when they found out their boyfriends were going back to America, and they started acting out, probably as a way of getting their attention at first, but then just because it just kind of got out of control. It started as petty crimes, moved on to arson. They burned down a tractor factory with nobody in it, but this escalated to more and more fires, and they were eventually caught. And the police had an airtight case against them because they detailed all of this in their diaries. They were easily convicted, and they were sentenced to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital until they were better, just an indefinite sentence. And at 19 years old, they were the youngest patients ever admitted there. What they found at the hospital was that they couldn't be together and they couldn't be apart. Put them in the same room together, they would fight with each other. Put them in separate rooms, they would stop eating. So they would put them back in the same room, and then the pattern would repeat itself. Eventually, they were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and they were separated completely into 2 different wards, heavily medicated, and after about 2 years, they finally started speaking again. And this is when things finally started to get a little bit better for the twins. The psychiatric treatment began to work after a while. They were allowed to write letters to each other and communicate that way. After they got a little bit better, they were able to see each other again, but they did finally become their own people. But they weren't happy people. They wrote in their journals and in letters to each other that they believed that the only way either of them could be happy is if the other one was dead, that as long as the other one existed, they were going to be miserable. They seemed to have sort of a death pact. They knew that they couldn't be with each other and they couldn't be without each other. They were locked in together until one of them died. In March of 1993, the sisters were moved to Caswell Minimum Security Prison. This was like sort of a transitionary state before they could finally get back into public. And Jennifer told her parole officer that she knew that everything was going to get better because she was going to die soon. And it turned out the very next day, while they were being transported to their new location, Jennifer put her head on June's shoulder and passed away. It was determined that she had acute myocarditis, which is basically inflammation of the heart. It's a rare condition and usually not fatal. June spent 1 year at Caswell before she was released. And she went on to live a relatively normal rest of her life, free from prison, both real and imagined. What started as a childhood obsession transformed into full-blown schizophrenia by the time they were older, according to the people who studied them at the prison anyway. And they were almost like multiple personalities in one person's head. They couldn't be away from each other. They couldn't be together either without going crazy. Now, over the years, the twins have been depicted as evil or even possessed, but they were really just victims of mental illness, unable to break free of each other. I think this is true of a lot of people. Obviously, most people don't get that obsessed, and most people don't have that kind of mental illness that they clearly had. But, you know, a lot of the little idiosyncrasies we have when we're kids, if we don't, keep track of it, if we don't monitor that, it can sort of take over our personalities, and it can take over what we do in our lives if we don't watch it and if we're not careful. So maybe that can be the lesson we learn from the silent twins. Keep check of your obsessions. Don't let them get the most of you. So that's kind of sad, but very interesting to me. I've always been fascinated by their story. There's a lot of stuff out there on the internet that you can find about them, a really great documentary and whatnot. I will link all that down in the description below if you want to find out more about it. Please like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, check out some of my other stuff, and if you like those, hit subscribe. Be part of the team. It'd be a lot of fun. New videos every Wednesday, Monday. When do I do things? New videos every Monday and Thursday. Nailed it. All right, thanks a lot for watching. You guys go out, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys, take care. A while back, I did a video on 4 mysterious deaths and disappearances, but as many astute viewers may have pointed out, I dropped a little mystery at the very beginning of the video. The mystery of the missing story. Because at the beginning, I said this. When putting together a video of mysterious disappearances, there are a million options to choose from, many of which you guys have sent to me over the years, but the 5 that I picked here... So yeah, that video went long, and then we wound up cutting one of the stories for time, but it was interesting enough to carry its own video. So that's what I'm doing here today, but just to set this up real quick, they say that truth can be stranger than fiction. I don't know if this is necessarily stranger than fiction, but it certainly sounds like fiction. Like, I can't believe this hasn't been made into a movie. But anyway, with no further ado, I bring you the mysterious death of Rodney Marks. Antarctica is home to no one. Or maybe it's better to say it's home to everyone. Because of the Antarctic Treaty, the continent is open for all countries to perform scientific experiments, and no military action is allowed there. There are around 70 seasonal or year-round stations representing 29 countries around the world, and they study everything from geology to biology to astronomy. The U.S. keeps 3 stations going year-round and has the most personnel in Antarctica than any other country in the world, and the most famous of these stations is the Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station. No relation. Amundsen-Scott was built in 1956, and it specializes in astronomy and astrophysics due to its excellent optics down there at the South Pole, but also because they have a neutrino detector. One of the researchers that was stationed down there was a 32-year-old Australian named Rodney Marks. Rodney was described as a free-spirited, bearded, 6'2" scientist who liked to paint his fingernails black and color his hair purple. He had an interest in math and science from a very young age, and he wound up getting a PhD from the University of New South Wales in astronomy. So he was stationed in Edmonton, Scott in the year 2000 to work on the Antarctic submillimeter telescope, and things seemed to be going well for him. He had just gotten engaged, he played guitar in a metal band, he was popular and social around the station. He was settling in to overwinter there, winter being May to August down around the South Pole. But on May 11th, he started getting sick. He visited the station's Dr. Robert Thompson on 3 different occasions, each time feeling more pain and anxiety and shortness of breath. From there, he became disoriented and eventually had cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead on May 12th. Thompson told the rest of the crew that he had died of unknown natural causes. Now, because of the brutal Antarctic winter, his body couldn't be flown out, so it was actually put on storage until October before it was finally sent to Christchurch, New Zealand, eventually on its way to Australia. But it was in Christchurch where a forensic pathologist came to some shocking news about Marks. Apparently, he was in perfect health, but he died from complications from consuming around 150 milliliters of methanol. As you can imagine, this raised a lot of questions. Did Marks commit suicide? Did it happen by accident? Could somebody have poisoned him? Methanol was kept at the station to clean the telescope's cryogenic parts, which took place in January, so it had been in storage ever since then and locked away. So Detective Grant Wormold from New Zealand began to investigate the case, and he came to 4 possible conclusions: suicide, recreation, accident, or somebody spiked a drink. Suicide was quickly ruled out because Marks had a lot of things going on really well for him. The research was going well. He just gotten engaged. He had a long career ahead of him, you know. There were no warning signs in that direction whatsoever. And besides, he went to the doctor 3 different times. That's not something you do if you're trying to kill yourself. Recreational ingestion was considered because he was known as a heavy drinker. He also had Tourette's. It was thought that maybe he might have drinking more to cope with his Tourette syndromes, but the station had a well-stocked bar. There was no reason for him to resort to drinking methanol. And as far as accidentally drinking it, it was clearly labeled as poison and locked away in a cabinet. Like, there's no way he could have just accidentally had it not knowing what it was, which goes back to the whole suicide thing that was ruled out. So that only leaves one more option. And as Dr. Wormold concluded in his report, quote, "In my view, it's most likely Dr. Marks ingested the methanol unknowingly. That means he was poisoned by someone. If this is true, this would make Rodney Marks the first and only person murdered at the South Pole. And whoever did it got away with it. How is this not a movie? There were only 49 people there. They were completely snowed in. Nobody was getting in or out. It's a whodunit set at the South Pole. It's Clue meets The Thing. But yeah, the New Zealand police weren't able to solve this case. They actually placed some of the blame at the feet of the United States National Science Foundation, who runs our Antarctic programs down there. They say that they weren't very forthcoming with information. The NSF denies this claim. But there is some weird stuff about this. The NSF sent questionnaires to all 49 people that worked with Marks at the time, and out of those 49 people, only 13 responded with answers. And that Dr. Thompson guy, nobody seems to know where he is now. Could it be that being cooped up in isolation for long periods of time can make a person go a little nuts? It definitely played a part in an attempted murder at the Russian station in 2018 when an engineer seemed to have kind of had a mental breakdown and stabbed a welder in the chest. The welder actually survived and eventually forgave the guy. But anyway, all jokes aside, it is a tragedy and it's a very weird case. Maybe he was murdered. Maybe he just did something crazy out of sheer boredom. We may never know, but that's what makes it a compelling mystery. Okay, so actually after looking into this a little bit further, after I recorded the previous bit, I did run into some reports that apparently Rodney kept his desk notoriously messy and did keep around on his desk cans of methanol and ethanol and stuff like that. And they think that he may have just kind of gotten drunk and Darwin awarded himself accidentally, but this does contradict reports that other people have said that all the methanol in the station was locked away in a safe place. Others say that he arrived at the South Pole Station with this weird exotic Portuguese liquor that he bought in New Zealand, and there was some speculation that it might have been some, back alley kind of thing and it was tainted in some way. And apparently the South Pole Station had a still where they made moonshine. And in the first runnings of moonshine, it actually does produce some methanol, and it's thought that maybe he might have consumed some of that and got that methanol into his system that way. Watch out for that South Pole moonshine, kids. And just to confuse things further, there were also reports that he had injection marks in his arm, which could mean all kinds of things. Really, it seems the more you look into this case, the weirder it gets. And it's easy to go down the rabbit holes of the salacious details and kind of get all caught up in that. But when it all comes down to it, this is the tragic loss of a young man who had a long and prosperous life ahead of him, and a family that has lost a loved one and are seeking closure. So let's hope that they get that. All right, that's it for now. Thanks again for watching. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening week. Stay safe, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. If you were a regular traveler along State Route 16 in West Virginia in the second half of the 20th century, you would be very familiar with this billboard. The sign had become something of a famous landmark after it went up in the 1950s, and it stayed there for the next 40 years. It served as a desperate plea from a family that had suffered an unspeakable tragedy, one that they were never really able to get past or make sense of. 5 children gone missing following a fire that consumed their home, one that was set by an arsonist on Christmas Eve, no less. But did they die in the fire, as the police suggest? Or was it possible that they were kidnapped? Maybe by the arsonist who set the fire. The family never stopped believing that they were kidnapped, which might sound like wishful thinking, but as time went on, many clues pointed to this possibility, that they were all still alive. Reports of seeing the kids in other states, rumors of police corruption, even a photo of one of the kids years later. Older, but recognizable. It's become an enduring mystery with hot takes on all sides of it. So today, let's talk about the Sodder Children mystery. So before I jump into this, let me just start by saying that this video is about a tragedy involving children. So there's some pretty heavy stuff in here. Obviously, I will cover it with as much tact and respect as possible. And this won't get gory or anything, but I just wanted to give you a warning. This might be a difficult subject matter for some of you. Also, you might see me adjusting some of the dialogue in this video to keep it from being demonetized. YouTube's been kind of ridiculous with that lately, so you might hear me bleeping out certain things. I'll tell you how you can see this uncensored at the end. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's set the scene. The year was 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and George Sodder was the owner of a fairly successful trucking company that served the coal and freight industries in the area. He and his wife Jenny had 10 children, ranging in age from 2 to 23, all living in their home except for one who was away in the Army. They were Catholic, if that helps to explain the family size. So on the night of Christmas Eve 1945, they all went to bed with dreams of celebrating the holiday the next day. Visions of sugar plums and whatnot. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang, and Jenny, the mother, answered it. She claimed to hear a woman's voice on the other end of the line, a voice she didn't recognize, and there was background noise that sounded like a party, so thinking it was a wrong number, she just hung up the phone. While she was up, she walked around the house to make sure everything was okay. The lights were on, one child was asleep on the couch, and it looked like the other children had gone to bed. Jenny did notice that the front door was unlocked, so she locked it and made her way back upstairs to her bedroom. She was then woken up at around 1 a.m. by a loud bang on the roof, followed by a rolling sound, like something had hit the roof and then rolled off of it. And then an hour later, smoke filled the house. George and Jenny jumped out of bed and rushed the children outside, but once they got out there, only 4 of the children were with them: Sylvia, George Jr., Marion, and John. The other 5 children were stuck in a room upstairs, so George rushed back into the house to try to save them, but at that point the stairs were blocked by the fire. Meanwhile, Marion ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department, but he couldn't get anybody to answer. This is way before 911, and Fayetteville had a volunteer fire department, and it was Christmas Eve. So the neighbor rushed to his car and drove around to find the fire chief, a guy named F.J. Morris. With the stairway blocked by fire, George tried to find other ways to get into the room, and he and one of the boys rushed to find a ladder that would get up to the second-story window, but the ladder they always kept at the side of the house was missing. George then tried to back his truck up to the house, thinking maybe he could stand on top of the truck and reach the window, but it wouldn't start. Actually, 2 different trucks he tried to start, and neither of them would start. At this point, there wasn't much for him to do, but just wait for the fire brigade to show up, which shouldn't have taken that long. The station was only 2.5 miles away, but for some reason, the crew didn't get there until 8 a.m. Jenny and George could only sit there helpless for 7 hours, watching their home burn to the ground, with their children inside. By the time the crew showed up, the house was reduced to smoke and ash, and the remaining Sodder children were nowhere to be seen. The fire investigators blamed the fire on faulty wiring and just assumed that the kids died in the fire, and their bodies were cremated. Those children were Betty, Jenny, Louis, Martha, and Maurice. This entire event was shrouded with questions and controversy, like why did none of his trucks start? What happened to their ladder? What was that bang that Jenny heard? And why did it take 7 hours for the fire department to show up? All of this was enough to make George and Jenny question, did the children actually on fire? There were a few things that made them think that maybe not. First of all, no remains were found of their children, no fire pattern that would indicate a burned body, no scraps of clothes left behind, and no bones. Not a single fragment of bone from 5 kids. Also, even though the investigators blamed faulty wiring, George had just had his home inspected just a few months before and was told that his wiring was fine. And they began to recall some other things that happened in the months leading up to the fire that seemed relevant to the situation, like the time a guy, threatened to burn down his house and children. Yeah, apparently an insurance salesman came by, and when George refused to buy life insurance from them, he flew into a rage and said, quote, "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed." End quote. That sounds like the most intense insurance salesman ever, and you might just think that it was a scare tactic, a warning of what could happen if he didn't protect himself with insurance, but there was a second part to that quote, according to George Sodder. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You are going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making against Mussolini." Yeah, see, there's something you kind of need to know about Fayetteville, West Virginia in 1945. It was a little fashy. Yeah, there was a huge Italian community in Fayetteville. It was a coal town. It attracted a lot of immigrant labor, and immigrants tend to cluster with other people that came from their home country. For whatever reason, Italians clustered there, including George Sodder. He was born Giorgio Soddu in Tula, Sardinia in 1895, and he immigrated to the U.S. in 1908. He started out on the Pennsylvania railroads, then moved to Smithers, West Virginia, and began working as a driver before starting his own trucking company that hauled dirt, freight, and coal. He later met Jenny Cipriati in a local store called the Music Box. She had immigrated to the U.S. when she was 3. So they got married, and like many other Italian immigrants in the area, they settled in Fayetteville. But as fascism began to spread in their home country and Mussolini came into power, many Italians in the U.S. embraced that ideology. They felt that fascism upheld traditions and rebalanced relationships between men and technology and restored connections between the people and the government. Besides, a lot of these immigrants weren't exactly welcomed when they got over here. You know how people are really cool about immigration? So yeah, after years of facing xenophobia and discrimination, this strong new Italy that Mussolini offered just gave him a sense of pride. But George was never on board with all this. He never really talked about his life in Italy, so we don't really know if he had a personal reason for this, but he severely disliked Mussolini, and he wasn't shy about it. This would often get him into heated arguments with community members, and it made him a few enemies, including that insurance salesman. But George didn't take the threat seriously. He also didn't take it seriously when he saw a stranger sitting in a car on the highway a few days before Christmas that was watching the younger Sodder children come home from school. They never figured out who that guy was or what he was doing. On December 29th, a funeral service was held for the children, but George and Jenny were too upset to attend. Soon after that, George wanted to create a memorial garden where the house was, so he had Jenny's brother fill in the basement with dirt using a bulldozer. And over the next couple of years, the Sodder family tried to just get on with their lives. They kind of half-heartedly accepted the story that faulty wiring started the fire. But then things changed in 1947. That year, an article was published in a magazine called Look that caught George and Jenny's attention. There was a photo in the article, and there were 7 children in the photo. And to them, one of the girls in the photo looked exactly like their daughter Betty. Yet the fact that no remains were ever found always left a question mark in their mind, and seeing this photo convinced them that maybe their children might be alive, that maybe this wasn't a fire at all. This was a kidnapping, and the fire was just a cover-up. If you remember from before, after she got that phone call, Jenny went downstairs and she assumed that the children had gone to bed, but the front door was unlocked. So there's a possibility somebody could have taken them. So they hired a private investigator to find the girl in the photo, but he wasn't able to track her down. Jenny actually started doing experiments with chicken and pork chop bones, basically burning them in a pan to see if she could make them reduce to ash, but she was never able to, repeat what had apparently happened in the fire. Also, there were some objects and furniture that survived in the nearby area, so it seemed like something of the kids would have been found. She even contacted a crematorium, and the employee there told her that bones remain after bodies are burned for 2 hours at 1,093 degrees Celsius, or 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But according to Jenny and George, the Sodder home burned down in 45 minutes. And besides all that, now stories were coming out of the woodwork of the children being spotted by people. One woman said that she saw them in a passing car while the fire was happening. Another woman at a tourist stop about 50 miles west of Fayetteville said that she saw them the morning after the fire. She told police that she had served them breakfast and that there was a car with a Florida license plate. And yet again, another woman said that she saw 4 of the 5 children at a Charleston hotel a week after the fire. She said 2 women and 2 men of Italian descent were with the children, and in a statement she said, quote, "I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked me in the hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed that I was being frozen out, so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. At this point, evidence just seemed to keep mounting, so George and Jenny sent a letter to the FBI in 1947 asking for its help. And the agents said that they would help if the local authorities gave them permission. And the Fayetteville Fire and Police Departments did not give them permission. So the Sodders hired another private eye, and this guy found out some interesting stuff, like the fact that the angry insurance salesman that had threatened them was actually on the coroner's jury that said that the fire was an accident. Yeah, the same guy who threatened to destroy his children. And he also found out that there were actually human remains found, at least according to the fire chief. Yeah, the fire chief claimed that he had found a human heart at the scene. Okay, to me this is where things really get weird. Yeah, the fire chief had told the family that there weren't any remains, and that was what was on the official report. But what he told the private investigator was that he had found a heart. And instead of entering into evidence or telling anyone about it, he chose to put it in a box and bury it at the scene. So the private eye asked if he could point out where he buried this box, because of course there's no way this actually happened, right? Actually, it did. Yeah, the fire chief came over, he pointed out where he had buried it, so they dug around and found a box with something inside of it. They took it to a local funeral director, and it turned out that the heart was nothing more than beef liver. So this forced the fire chief to admit that he did put a fake heart in a box and buried it. He said that he did this to placate the family and give them a sense of closure, and of course, to get them to stop their investigation. Okay, so at this point, the Sodders were just all in on trying to get to the bottom of this, so they began a new search of the fire scene in August 1949. They excavated the basement and searched through the dirt with a fine-tooth comb, looking for anything that might be their kids. What they found were some damaged coins, a burned dictionary, and several shards of vertebrae, which they sent to the Smithsonian Institution. When they got the report back from the Smithsonian, it showed that it belonged to somebody 16 to 17 years old. But the oldest Sodder child that had burned in the fire was 14 years old. But the real kicker was that none of the bones had been exposed to fire. The report said, quote, "It is very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful excavation of the basement of the house. One would expect to find the full skeletons of the 5 children rather than only 4 vertebrae. Also, how could every other bone in their body be burned down to ash, but these 4 vertebrae showed no exposure to fire whatsoever?" So what they concluded, according to the report, is that the dirt that Jenny's brother used to fill in the basement back when George wanted to create a memorial for the children, that thing, apparently wherever he got this dirt from, it had human remains in it. Just some random guy. So yeah, that's like a whole other mystery. And this is when the Sodders put up that billboard on Route 16 with the children's pictures and offered a $10,000 reward for information. And information started coming in. They received a letter from a woman in St. Louis who said that Martha was in a convent there. Another tip from Florida said that the children were staying with one of Jenny's distant relatives. And George traveled all over the country investigating every single one of these tips, and he always came back with nothing. This went on for decades. And then in 1967, literally 22 years after the fire, Jenny received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to her, and it had no return address on there, but it was postmarked in Kentucky. Inside the envelope was this photo. A handwritten note on the back of the photo said, quote, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil Boys, A90132 or 35. Louis was the name of one of the boys who died in the fire. He was 9 at the time, and the picture does bear a striking resemblance. Like, I gotta be honest, if somebody pointed me to these 2 pictures and said it was the same guy 20 years apart with no other context, I wouldn't think twice about it. I'd totally believe it. Of course, Louis didn't have a brother named Frank or Frankie, and the rest of the text on there, the numbers and whatnot, none of that made any sense to the Sodders. But they did think it could be him, so they hired another guy to track him down, and this private eye basically just took their money and didn't do anything. He was never heard from again. George died in 1969, and Jenny kept the billboard up and her hope alive for another 20 years before she died in 1989. Their children and grandchildren still continue this investigation. An investigation which has never actually been solved. So, there's really 2 questions here. 1, who started the fire? And 2, did the kids in the fire? As for the first question, it could have just been an accident. It was officially blamed on faulty wiring. That could be the case. I mean, yes, they did just have their house inspected, but inspectors aren't perfect. Plus, it was Christmas, so they may have had a lot of electrical lights plugged in and whatnot, maybe some candles burning. Actually, there is every year a documented spike in house fires during the holidays for this reason, so this might have just been another one of those. But George did make some enemies. And some of those Italian immigrants in Fayetteville were known to be part of the Sicilian mob, so yeah, some have expected that maybe they were involved. If it was a person who set the fire, maybe they threw an incendiary device on the roof, which would explain the noise that Jenny heard before the fire started. Or that phone call may have been someone checking to make sure they were home or distracting them while they were actually kidnapping the kids downstairs. Or it may have just been a wrong number. Now, the fact that that insurance salesman who had threatened them was also on the board that ruled that no foul play was involved, that's pretty sketchy, I mean, clearly. And the fact that the police and the fire investigators seemed unwilling to investigate it further and, refused to work with the FBI kind of hints at some corruption there. And as for the kids, the big question is, whether or not that house could have actually completely cremated their bodies. And the answer is possibly. So George and Jenny said that the house burned down in 45 minutes. But it smoldered for another 7 hours before the fire crew showed up. And according to the experts and the research that I did anyway, that could actually fully cremate a body. There were also reports that George had kept coal in his basement, so if that's the case, that would do it. Now, as for George's trucks not starting, at least one of George's trucks was kind of notorious for flooding the engine if you tried to start it too quickly, and I'm sure he was trying to start that thing as quickly as possible that night. Now, why the fire crew took 7 hours to show up is another big one. Now, it's easy to see collusion in that, but also it was Christmas Eve, and it was a volunteer fire department in 1945. They could have just been at their jobs. As for all those reports that came in of sightings of the children with Italian immigrants, there were a lot of Italian immigrants around there, and they had a lot of kids. Now, there is a question around, after all these years, why none of these kids had ever contacted their parents. They were old enough to remember them. Some of them were teenagers. Some had suggested that maybe they had been told that if they contacted their parents, it would bring harm to their families. Maybe something worse happened. That photo of Lewis is pretty weird, though. It could have just been a hoax. People can be cruel. Anyway, there's endless debate about the fate of the Sodder children. As you guys know, I tend to think that the most mundane answer is usually the right one, so we might just be looking at an extremely tragic Christmas fire and heartbroken parents who couldn't cope with the loss. But there is plenty of room for doubt. There's a lot of weird stuff in this case, so I'll put it to you guys. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. The Sodder Children story was one of those videos that I thought for sure would do really well, and then it just, kind of didn't. Yeah, I'm starting to notice any videos that deal with traumatic stories around children or animals tend to not perform very well. I guess I have an audience of people that don't like hurting children or something. But I guess that's what I get for cultivating an audience of empathetic and compassionate people. What am I going to do with you guys? I'll tell you what you can do with them. Oh my god, a clone. I thought I put you guys in the... We breached containment. Uh-oh. Here's what you do. Black Friday sale. A little early, but okay. All this year you've been doing these limited time merch drops, the dodecahedron, the Tritium Tour shirt, and all that. Yeah? And every single time when it's over, you get all these emails and comments from people that say that they missed it. Hey, it's not my fault if they're not reading the newsletter. Yes, they should be reading the newsletter. You're weirdly powerful. You thank your audience by bringing back all those items on Black Friday with a nice little discount. That is a good idea. It's better than pre-launching a book that's not going to be ready for the next 7 months. I know, right? What kind of idiot would do that? Announce it next month. Tease it today. Okay. How should I do that? You just did, my friend. You just did. Anyway, bring back the sketches. People like the sketches. Do they? Anyway, let's wrap up this compilation with a couple of videos on the Somerton Man, which was one of Australia's longest and most famous John Doe cases until just a couple years ago, actually. And I got to interview one of the people who finally solved the case, which is, I think, one of the cooler things I've done on this channel. Anyway, Somerton Man. Enjoy. Alas, that spring should vanish with the rose, that youth's sweet-scented manuscript should close, the nightingale that in the branches sang, ah, whence and whither flown again, who knows? Ah, love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire, would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire? Ah, moon of my delight, whose know'st no wane, the moon of heaven is rising once again. How oft hereafter rising shall she look through this same garden after me in vain? And when thyself with shining foot shall pass among the guest stars scattered on the grass, and in thy joyous errand reach the spot where I made one turn down an empty glass. When telling a story, begin at the beginning only works in fiction, because when you create a story, you get to decide where it begins. Nonfiction is different, because there's always something that comes before the beginning. Or, as B.I. Hartshorne once wrote, life is just one darn thing after another. All of that is just a pretentious way of saying that there's no good place to start the story of the Somerton Man. It's a case with so many twists and turns and false starts that creating a coherent narrative is damn near impossible. But this is where I choose to start. Early in the morning of November 30th, 1948, a train ticket was purchased at the railway station in Adelaide, Australia. It would have taken this passenger to a beach called Henley Beach on the west coast of Adelaide. It's a half-hour trip followed by a short bus ride with some walking involved. Maybe the traveler decided that this trip was too complicated, maybe he missed his train, but for whatever reason, the ticket went unused. And by 7 p.m. he was spotted at a different beach, a 40-minute walk from the bus stop. The name of this beach was Somerton Beach. And however this mystery traveler wound up on Somerton Beach, that would be a name that would stick with him for the next 74 years. It was a local jeweler named John Lyons who saw him on the evening of the 30th as he and his wife were strolling on the beach. He was lying on his back, legs crossed, with his head and shoulders popped up against the seawall. According to the Lyons, he seemed to raise his arm and then drop it, like maybe he was trying to wave at them. They assumed he was drunk and sleeping it off, so they just continued on their way. So the next morning, Mr. Lyons decided he was going to go take a swim with some buddies, and on the way, he saw two men with horses standing in that same spot. It took him a second to realize that they were standing over the same drunk man from the night before, kind of checking on him to see if he was okay. Spoiler alert, he was not. When the police arrived, they found a body with no identification of any kind. No wallet, no passport, just that unused train ticket to a different beach. Also, all the tags had been removed from his clothing, which seems to be a common thing in these unidentified cases. That was true in the Peter Bergman and Isdal woman cases too. He was decently tall for the time, 5'11", European, with hair the coroner described as ginger but mousy colored. He was thought to be around 40 to 50 years old and well built, particularly his legs. Apparently his calves were noteworthy. They were described as high and well developed, like a woman who wore high heels. This is according to a taxidermist named Paul Lawson, who was brought in to make a cast of the body. And on top of that, his toes were, quote, joined together toward a common apex as if he wore pointed shoes. This might be making it sound like he was some kind of cross-dresser, and I guess, I don't know, maybe he could have been, but these are also traits that are associated with ballet dancers, particularly the muscular legs. But there was one other identifying feature that stood out, and that was his teeth. He didn't have any lateral incisors. These are the teeth that flank the front two incisors. So, most people have incisors, then lateral incisors, and then canines. Well, he just had incisors and then canines. And for the record, he was missing several molars as well, but those had clearly been pulled at some point. But the missing teeth was a big lead because it was clearly something that somebody would recognize or notice in conversation. So, surely somebody out there had had a conversation with this guy and noticed his teeth like this. And besides that, it could have also been genetics. So maybe there were family members out there with the same thing. And yet, nobody came forward. The police circulated his photo far and wide, and they checked his fingerprints against everything in Australia and New Zealand. Partner agencies then checked with the whole English-speaking world, and yeah, no matches came up. To be clear, they did get a lot of responses from the general public, but nothing that led to an identification. As for what killed this guy, he didn't seem to have any physical trauma on him, but his stomach was congested with blood, which suggested maybe he was poisoned. His official cause of death was heart failure, with a strong suspicion of poisoning. And they say strong suspicion of poisoning because they didn't actually find any poison in his body, or on or around his body at the scene. 3 top experts worked together to figure it out, and they were able to rule out most poisons. The only one that really stuck was a glucoside poison like digitalis. But this had its issues too. Because for the dose to be so small that they couldn't detect it, it would have taken way too long to kill him, and a large dose would have been easily detectable. There also wasn't any vomit at the scene, and vomiting is a symptom of glucoside overdose. The coroner, Thomas Cleland was his name, he got around that by suggesting that maybe he got poisoned way earlier and before he went to the beach. Another symptom of glucoside poisoning is convulsions, and this might possibly explain the arm raise that the lion saw when they walked by. So they walked by at 7 p.m. The coroner put his time of death at around 2 a.m., which gives the poison about 7 hours or so to have killed him, which might be enough time for an untraceably small dose to be lethal. So the glucoside poison theory isn't perfect, but it's somewhat plausible. Still doesn't answer the question of why, though. Did he do it himself? Was he murdered? The case kind of hit a dead end at that point. Until 6 weeks later. The police caught a break with the staff of the Adelaide railway station when they presented the police with a suitcase. It had been in the cloakroom since November 30th, the day that the Somerton Man's train ticket was purchased. Unfortunately, nobody could remember the guy who dropped it off, but there were some clues that tied it back to the Somerton Man. Like the clothes. They had their tags removed as well. And they were repaired with a distinctly colored orange thread that matched the same thread that was used on repairs on the Somerton Man's clothes. There was one clue that looked pretty promising. Some of the clothes had the name T. Keene on them. But nobody with that name was reported missing, and there was reason to believe that these clothes had been purchased secondhand. Yeah, the police actually brought a tailor in to give an expert opinion on it, and he said that some of the stitching in a coat was done by a machine that's only used in America. So he was either some kind of world traveler or he bought it secondhand. Another interesting thing was a stenciling kit. And this could have been a few things. He might have been employed on a ship. Often third officers on ships would use them to label cargo on merchant vessels. They also thought he could have been making art or decorative cards with it. There were envelopes and airmail stickers in there as well. So he was a guy with a unique set of teeth that may have been a ballet dancer or a sailor or an artist who made cards for friends. None of this actually helped to identify him, and once again, the case hit a brick wall. And then a couple months later, 5 months or so after his body was discovered, a new clue emerged. A clue that became such an integral part of the case that it gave the case a whole new name. A professor of pathology at Adelaide University named John Cleland, who just happened to be the coroner's cousin, was examining the personal effects, and he found something that nobody had ever found before. A tiny hidden pocket in the trousers. And inside this pocket was a small slip of paper, and written on that paper in printed font were the words Tamum Shud. Tamum Shud is a Persian term that can be translated as full up or fed up, or it is the end. Those are the last two words of a 900-year-old book of Persian poetry called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Yet finding a note that says the end in the pocket of a dead guy does not feel coincidental. Was it a kind of suicide note? Or a message from a murderer? Maybe it was a message from a hitman to his employers saying that the job was done. Or maybe this was a warning. Maybe the Somerton Man was in a line of work that could get you killed, and this was a threat to others like him. Like, was he a spy? Or a mobster? Somewhere out there was a copy of the Rubaiyat with the last two words torn out of it. And if they could find that book, it might provide some answers. And a few months later in July, they found it. A businessman from Adelaide had read about the book in a newspaper and came forward with it, saying that he'd found it in the back of his car when he was visiting with his brother-in-law. They were parked on Jetty Road, about a half-hour walk from Somerton Beach, and Jetty Road is a popular shopping destination, and it was a warm day, so they were out shopping, and they let the windows down while they were shopping, and apparently somebody just tossed it in the back seat. See, now some puzzle pieces are starting to come together. The Somerton Man, or maybe the person who killed him, was walking toward the beach with this book in their hands. They tear out this last little page and they just kind of casually toss it in a car as they pass by. Except, of course, there's a wrinkle in this. Because they found that book in their back seat on November 20th, 10 whole days before the Somerton Man died. And they were sure about that because they were there to see an air show, which was on the 20th. So, what? Did he wait 10 days to kill himself? Did the murderer wait 10 days? Did he stay there for 10 days? Because no hotel staff anywhere in the area recalled seeing him. Yeah, in the Peter Bergman and Isdall woman cases, there were multiple hotel sightings. Maybe he was from Adelaide and just came in for a day 10 days earlier to sort of scope the place out and didn't stay in a hotel? But maybe the biggest question is, why toss it in the back of someone's car? Why not just throw it in a trash can? Unless there's something in that book that you want someone to find. Turns out there was something interesting in this book. There was some handwriting inside the back cover. It was hard to see with the naked eye, but it showed up under UV light. What they found was 2 phone numbers and an indecipherable code. Because of course there was. The first number went to a random business that didn't have anything useful. They didn't know anything about the guy. But the second one went to a nurse named Joe Thompson. Joe Thompson was born Jessica Ellen Harkness in 1921. She used Joe as a nickname, and Thompson was the name of the guy that she was dating at the time, a guy named Prosper Thompson, who actually went by George Thompson, because apparently in Australia you're legally required to go by a nickname. I couldn't find if she was engaged to George at the time, but for whatever reason, Jessica Harkness went by Joe Thompson when the police called. Not only was her name in this book, but she only lived about a half a mile down from Somerton Beach, so yeah, police called her to see if she could identify the body. Actually, the Somerton Man had been buried about a month before on June 14th, so they had her view a plaster cast of his head and chest. She said she didn't recognize him and wasn't too much help to the police, but the taxidermist Paul Lawson, he told a different story. He made the cast, and he was there when she viewed it, and he claimed that she looked like she was gonna pass out when she saw it, like she physically reacted to it. By the way, Paul Lawson just died in October of last year. He was 103 years old. He was pretty much the only surviving person involved in this case. So Joe Thompson may or may not have been honest with the police about recognizing the body, but she did admit that she had given a copy of that same book to somebody several years earlier. The year was 1944, the war was still going on, and she was training to be a nurse when she met a man in the army named Alfred Boxall. They had only met a couple of times, but before they left on deployment, they did this thing where the ladies would give gifts to the men before they went off to war, and her gift to him was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Boom! Finally, after 8 months of investigating, they had their man. So they tracked him down to notify his next of kin, and thankfully that was easy to do because he was still alive. He was still alive. Yeah, not only was he still alive, but he still had the copy of the book that Joe had given him, and yeah, nothing was torn out of it. And Joe signed it, but she signed it under a different name, Justin. Nobody's sure why. Her real name was Jessica. Maybe Justin was a take on Jessica. Maybe, I don't know, was she always Justin with people? I don't know. Australia. The point is, it was yet another promising lead that went nowhere. But what about that code? It consisted of 6 lines of random letters, 51 letters total, with 2 shortest lines crossed out. And look, here's the thing. I could go on and on about this code. I actually cut a whole bunch of stuff out of this script because it just keeps going. But the long and short of it is, nobody's ever cracked it. 74 years now, people have been trying. Nobody's ever done it. I could go into all the methods that were used and the different experts that were called in, theories around it. Some people suggested there might be micro-writing inside the lines of the letters that contain a second hidden code. Some people even tested whether or not it was just nothing but randomness by getting people drunk and having them draw names out of a hat. I'll put links down below if you think you can solve it, really have at it. But long story short, for whatever reason, there is an uncrackable code at the back of this book. So here come the spy theories. Some have speculated that the Somerton Man was a Soviet agent, and that Jessica, aka Joe, aka Justin, was his partner, contact, or handler. And I know you might be sitting there thinking, of course, some conspiracy theorists are going to make it about spying or the Cold War or something like that. That's always brought up in these cases. They said the same thing about Peter Bergman, said the same thing about the Isdal woman. But here's the thing. One of the people that believes this theory is Joe Thompson's daughter. Yeah, Kate Thompson, she's the daughter of Joe and George. She thinks her mother was a Soviet spy. She told Australia 60 Minutes that her mother could speak Russian, and nobody in the family knew how she learned that. She kept that a secret from everyone.
She said to me, "Oh, surprised that I can still quite understand Russian."
She dropped that bombshell.
Yeah, so when did you learn Russian? Well, that's for me to know.
She also says that her mom once told her that she did know who the Somerton Man was, but lied to the police about it because it was, quote, not at their level. What she didn't tell her, of course, was who the man actually was or how she knew him. But I mean, the spy thing, it kind of makes sense. I mean, dying from an undetectable poison is a pretty spy way to go. And this was right at the beginning of the Cold War. It's even possible he might have been a spy during World War II. But of course, if it's a spy thing, that brings up a million questions. I mean, had he been double-crossed or compromised in some way? Did he know too much? Did Joe actually have him killed? Was he protecting her? If the Somerton Man was a foreign agent, we'll probably never know exactly what happened to him. It's a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a flour tortilla. A mystery burrito, if you will. But there is one more theory. It's a pretty compelling one. It's also one of the saddest. It's a theory put forth by Adelaide University professor Derek Abbott, who's been kind of obsessed with this case going all the way back to the 90s. He wanted to focus on the genetic abnormalities in the Somerton Man case, like the missing teeth, for example. That only shows up in 2.1% of males. But he also found something else. When he and his team got a chance to study the plaster cast, he noted something interesting about the ear. So our ears have a couple of structures in the external ear canal. There's the concha cymba in the upper portion and the concha cavum below. Usually the concha cymba is smaller than the concha cavum, but with the Somerton Man, it was reversed, with a large cymba and a small cavum. That's a small thing, probably not something most people would notice, which is why it went unnoticed for so long, but only 1% to 2% of Caucasian people have ears like that. So between the teeth thing and the ear thing, the chance that some totally unrelated person would have both of those two genetic abnormalities is really slim. And yet, they did find somebody with both of those traits. A guy named Robin Thompson. And yet, if that name Thompson sounds familiar, that's because his mother is Jo Thompson. I know, right, wait, it gets better. So Jo had been dating George Thompson for a few years at that point. She was even going by his name, so you could even say they were common law married if you wanted to. So when Robin was born, nobody questioned whether or not that was George's son. But Robin was born in 1947, which would have made him about 18 months old when the Somerton Man died. So, considering that he had the same teeth and the same ears as the Somerton Man, this got Derek Abbott more curious. He wanted to know more about him, like what he did for a living. And it turns out what he did for a living, he was a ballet dancer. Yes, Robin Thompson was a professional ballet dancer for the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company. There's plenty of pictures out there of him during his ballet company days. You can clearly see the teeth, you can see the ears, and those well-developed calves. The story just writes itself at this point. That Jo Thompson, spy or no spy, had an affair with the Somerton Man and gave birth to his child. Of course, being basically married to George Thompson at the time, she had to keep that secret and keep him away, and being spurned by the woman he loved and being forced to watch another man raise his child, the Somerton Man spiraled into a kind of depression and decided to take his own life, leaving one last heartbreaking note for her. It's romantic and tragic. Maybe he visited there 10 days before his death to make one final appeal to her, and after that failed, he stopped at a bookstore. Or, if you still want to believe that he was murdered, maybe he threatened to reveal the truth about her son, and she had him taken out. There's still the possibility that she was a spy. Unfortunately, we'll never get a confession out of Jo Thompson because she passed away in 2007. But fortunately, Professor Abbott had seen some episodes of Maury Povich, so he knew that a DNA test would clear this whole thing up. So he tried to contact Robin to see if he could get a DNA sample from him, but Robin had died literally 2 months before that, and was cremated. By the way, it's a pretty good argument for not being cremated. You never know when your body might be needed to solve a 70-year-old mystery. This, I'm sure, was a huge disappointment to Professor Abbott, but he did have one more possible option. Robin had a daughter. Her name is Rachel Egan. She's the daughter of Roma Egan, who was also part of the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company with Robin. Lots of R's there. But somewhere along the way they had a daughter, and for unknown reasons they decided to give her up for adoption. So when Professor Abbott reached out to her about this, she was eager to find out more about her family and her potential grandfather. So yeah, she agreed to participate. The only problem was that the only DNA they had from the Somerton Man was some hair follicle DNA from the plaster cast. So not much to work with, but they gave it a shot. The results, just like everything in this case, just brought up more questions. Like, nothing was found that specifically tied her to the Somerton Man, but there were some markers that tied her to George Thompson. So does that kill the whole theory? Was George Thompson Robin's father the whole time? Maybe, maybe not. It was a small sample, and DNA analysis is far more complicated than what you see on TV. And it's possible that she might have been related to George Thompson through some other circuitous means. I mean, apparently she was also related to Thomas Jefferson. Or maybe Thomas Jefferson killed the Somerton... No, that wouldn't work. To be sure, they needed a better DNA sample, which the only way to get that is if they exhumed the body. And Professor Abbott worked for years to get this done. Eventually, his perseverance did finally pay off because in early 2021, the Somerton Man was exhumed. And now, better DNA tests are now being conducted. So whether he turns out to be Rachel's grandfather or not, this should be a huge step forward in identifying the Somerton Man. And hopefully answer more questions than it brings up. Because right now, there's a lot of questions. Was he a spy that knew too much? A mobster who got in too deep? A jilted lover who couldn't see his son? Or just a dude with some banging legs that got a hold of the wrong book? With any luck, we'll find out soon. And the Somerton Man, whoever he is, may finally have some peace. By the way, as if this whole thing couldn't get any weirder, in the process of trying to solve this mystery together, Derek Abbott and Rachel Egan fell in love and got married. They'd been together for 11 years now and had 3 kids. After obsessing about this mystery man for decades, he may now be raising his great-grandkids. Can't make this stuff up. So yeah, Tamam Shud, only in fiction. Real life is just one darn thing after another. I know this is one of the more popular mysteries on the internet, so yeah, what's your favorite theory? What do you think happened? Who do you think this man was? And what's the deal with Joe Thompson? Talk about it down below. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Alas, that spring should vanish with the rose, that you sweet-scented manuscript should close, the nightingale that in the branches sang, ah, whence and whither flown again, who knows? Ah, love, could thou and I with fate conspire to grasp this sorry scheme of things entire, would not we shatter it to bits and then remold it nearer to the heart's desire? Ah, moon of my delight, whose notes no wane, the moon of heaven is rising once again. How oft hereafter rising shall she look through this same garden after me in vain? And when thyself with shining foot shall pass among the guest stars scattered on the grass, and in thy joyous errand reach the spot where I made one turn down an empty glass. On Tuesday of this week, July 26th, headlines around the world declared that the Somerton Man, the unidentified man found dead on an Australian beach in 1948, had finally been identified through DNA evidence. And my inbox exploded. I literally couldn't even count all the links that were sent to me, and I want to thank everybody who reached out and asked me to revisit this. So here's the deal. I was actually considering re-uploading this video anyway, because guess what? It got demonetized. Yeah, YouTube's been pretty bad about that lately. Yeah, apparently one image that we used of the body on the beach was just a bridge too far for YouTube. The irony is it wasn't a real photo. It was an obviously photoshopped recreation. But anyway, for that reason, I was thinking of re-uploading it and taking that photo out so it could be monetized. But now that there's this new information, that's reason to do a whole new video. So this video is a little bit of an attempt to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm going to include the original video in its entirety, with the exception of that one photo. And I'm going to include all the new information at the end of it. So if you've already seen the Somerton Man video and you just want to hear the new stuff, feel free to jump ahead. It won't hurt my feelings. I'll put a timestamps down below so you can, kind of go by the timeline right here. Or you can just skip ahead to here. Just go on ahead to here. I would say it, but I'm recording it right now, so I don't know where here is. So. But if you have the time, I would encourage you to watch the entire video. I'm pretty proud of this video. It's a real roller coaster of a story. And I think that the story kind of provides extra context to the new info at the end. So anyway, without any further ado, let's roll that title sequence again and pick up where we left off. When telling a story, begin at the beginning only works in fiction. Because when you create a story, you get to decide where it begins. Nonfiction is different, because there's always something that comes before the beginning. Or, as B.I. Hartshorne once wrote, life is just one darn thing after another. All of that is just a pretentious way of saying that there's no good place to start the story of the Somerton Man. It's a case with so many twists and turns and false starts that creating a coherent narrative is damn near impossible. But this is where I choose to start. Early in the morning of November 30th, 1948, a train ticket was purchased at the railway station in Adelaide, Australia. It would have taken this passenger to a beach called Henley Beach on the west coast of Adelaide. It's a half-hour trip followed by a short bus ride with some walking involved. Maybe the traveler decided that this trip was too complicated, maybe he missed his train, but for whatever reason, the ticket went unused. And by 7 p.m. he was spotted at a different beach, a 40-minute walk from the bus stop. The name of this beach was Somerton Beach. And however this mystery traveler wound up on Somerton Beach, that would be a name that would stick with him for the next 74 years. It was a local jeweler named John Lyons who saw him on the evening of the 30th as he and his wife were strolling on the beach. He was lying on his back, legs crossed, with his head and shoulders propped up against the seawall. According to the Lyons, he seemed to raise his arm and then drop it, like maybe he was trying to wave at them. They assumed he was drunk and sleeping it off, so they just continued on their way. So the next morning, Mr. Lyons decided he was going to go take a swim with some buddies, and on the way, he saw two men with horses standing in that same spot. It took him a second to realize that they were standing over the same drunk man from the night before, kind of checking on him to see if he was okay. Spoiler alert, he was not. When the police arrived, they found a body with no identification of any kind. No wallet, no passport, just that unused train ticket to a different beach. Also, all the tags had been removed from his clothing, which seems to be a common thing in these unidentified cases. That was true in the Peter Bergman and Isdall woman cases too. He was decently tall for the time, 5'11", European, with hair the coroner described as ginger but mousy colored. He was thought to be around 40 to 50 years old and well built, particularly his legs. Apparently his calves were noteworthy. They were described as high and well developed, like a woman who wore high heels. This is according to a taxidermist named Paul Lawson, who was brought in to make a cast of the body. And on top of that, his toes were, quote, joined together toward a common apex as if he wore pointed shoes. This might be making it sound like he was some kind of cross-dresser, and I guess, I don't know, maybe he could have been, but these are also traits that are associated with ballet dancers, particularly the muscular legs. But there was one other identifying feature that stood out, and that was his teeth. He didn't have any lateral incisors. These are the teeth that flank the front two incisors. So, most people have incisors, then lateral incisors, and then canines. Well, he just had incisors and then canines. And for the record, he was missing several molars as well, but those had clearly been pulled at some point. But the missing teeth was a big lead because it was clearly something that somebody would recognize or notice in conversation. So, surely somebody out there had had a conversation with this guy and noticed his teeth like this. And besides that, it could have also been genetic. So maybe there were family members out there with the same thing. And yet, nobody came forward. The police circulated his photo far and wide, and they checked his fingerprints against everything in Australia and New Zealand. Partner agencies then checked with the whole English-speaking world, and yeah, no matches came up. To be clear, they did get a lot of responses from the general public, but nothing that led to an identification. As for what killed this guy, he didn't seem to have any physical trauma on him, but his stomach was congested with blood, which suggested maybe he was poisoned. His official cause of death was heart failure, with a strong suspicion of poisoning. And they say strong suspicion of poisoning because they didn't actually find any poison in his body, or on or around his body at the scene. 3 top experts worked together to figure it out, and they were able to rule out most poisons. The only one that really stuck was a glucoside poison like digitalis. But this had its issues too, because for the dose to be so small that they couldn't detect it, it would have taken way too long to kill him, and a large dose would have been easily detectable. There also wasn't any vomit at the scene, and vomiting is a symptom of glucoside overdose. The coroner, Thomas Cleland was his name, he got around that by suggesting that maybe he got poisoned way earlier and before he went to the beach. Another symptom of glucoside poisoning is convulsions, and this might possibly explain the arm raise that the Lyons saw when they walked by. So they walked by at 7 p.m. The coroner put his time of death at around 2 a.m., which gives the poison about 7 hours or so to have killed him, which might be enough time for an untraceably small dose to be lethal. So the glucoside poison theory isn't perfect, but it's somewhat plausible. Still doesn't answer the question of why, though. Did he do it himself? Was he murdered? The case kind of hit a dead end at that point. Until 6 weeks later. The police caught a break with the staff of the Adelaide railway station when they presented the police with a suitcase. It had been in the cloakroom since November 30th, the day that the Somerton Man's train ticket was purchased. Unfortunately, nobody could remember the guy who dropped it off, but there were some clues that tied it back to the Somerton Man. Like the clothes. They had their tags removed as well. And they were repaired with a distinctly colored orange thread that matched the same thread that was used on repairs on the Somerton Man's clothes. There was one clue that looked pretty promising. Some of the clothes had the name T. Keane on them. But nobody with that name was reported missing, and there was reason to believe that these clothes had been purchased secondhand. Yeah, the police actually brought a tailor in to give an expert opinion on it, and he said that some of the stitching in a coat was done by a machine that's only used in America. So he was either some kind of world traveler or he bought it secondhand. Another interesting thing was a stenciling kit. And this could have been a few things. He might have been employed on a ship. Often third officers on ships would use them to label cargo on merchant vessels. They also thought he could have been making art or decorative cards with it. There were envelopes and airmail stickers in there as well. So he was a guy with a unique set of teeth that may have been a ballet dancer or a sailor or an artist who made cards for friends. None of this actually helped to identify him, and once again, the case hit a brick wall. And then a couple months later, 5 months or so after his body was discovered, a new clue emerged. A clue that became such an integral part of the case that it gave the case a whole new name. A professor of pathology at Adelaide University named John Cleland, who just happened to be the coroner's cousin, was examining the personal effects, and he found something that nobody had ever found before. A tiny hidden pocket in the trousers. And inside this pocket was a small slip of paper, and written on that paper in printed font were the words Tamum Shud. Tamum Shud is a Persian term that can be translated as full up or fed up, or it is the end. Those are the last two words of a 900-year-old book of Persian poetry called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Yet finding a note that says the end in the pocket of a dead guy does not feel coincidental. Was it a kind of suicide note? Or a message from a murderer? Maybe it was a message from a hitman to his employers saying that the job was done. Or maybe this was a warning. Maybe the Somerton Man was in a line of work that could get you killed, and this was a threat to others like him. Like, was he a spy? Or a mobster? Somewhere out there was a copy of the Rubaiyat with the last two words torn out of it. And if they could find that book, it might provide some answers. And a few months later in July, they found it. A businessman from Adelaide had read about the book in a newspaper and came forward with it saying that he'd found it in the back of his car when he was visiting with his brother-in-law. They were parked on Jetty Road, about a half-hour walk from Somerton Beach, and Jetty Road is a popular shopping destination, and it was a warm day, so they were out shopping and they let the windows down while they were shopping, and apparently somebody just tossed it in the back seat. See, now some puzzle pieces are starting to come together. The Somerton Man, or maybe the person who killed him, was walking toward the beach with this book in their hands. They tear out this last little page and they just kind of casually toss it in a car as they pass by. Except, of course, there's a wrinkle in this. Because they found that book in their back seat on November 20th, 10 whole days before the Somerton Man died. And they were sure about that because they were there to see an air show, which was on the 20th. So, what? Did he wait 10 days to kill himself? Did the murderer wait 10 days? Did he stay there for 10 days? Because no hotel staff anywhere in the area recalled seeing him. Yeah, in the Peter Bergman and Isdall woman cases, there were multiple hotel sightings. Maybe he was from Adelaide and just came in for a day 10 days earlier to sort of scope the place out and didn't stay in a hotel? But maybe the biggest question is, why toss it in the back of someone's car? Why not just throw it in a trash can? Unless there's something in that book that you want someone to find. Turns out there was something interesting in this book. There was some handwriting inside the back cover. It was hard to see with the naked eye, but it showed up under UV light. What they found was 2 phone numbers and an indecipherable code. Because of course there was. The first number went to a random business that didn't have anything useful. They didn't know anything about the guy. But the second one went to a nurse named Jo Thompson. Jo Thompson was born Jessica Ellen Harkness in 1921. She used Joe as a nickname, and Thompson was the name of the guy that she was dating at the time, a guy named Prosper Thompson, who actually went by George Thompson, because apparently in Australia you're legally required to go by a nickname. I couldn't find if she was engaged to George at the time, but for whatever reason, Jessica Harkness went by Jo Thompson when the police called. Not only was her name in this book, but she only lived about a half a mile down from Somerton Beach, so yeah, police called her to see if she could identify the body. Actually, the Somerton Man had been buried about a month before on June 14th, so they had her view a plaster cast of his head and chest. She said she didn't recognize him and wasn't too much help to the police, but the taxidermist Paul Lawson, he told a different story. He made the cast, and he was there when she viewed it, and he claimed that she looked like she was gonna pass out when she saw it, like she physically reacted to it. By the way, Paul Lawson just died in October of last year. He was 103 years old. He was pretty much the only surviving person involved in this case. So Jo Thompson may or may not have been honest with the police about recognizing the body, but she did admit that she had given a copy of that same book to somebody several years earlier. The year was 1944, the war was still going on, and she was training to be a nurse when she met a man in the army named Alfred Boxall. They had only met a couple of times, but before they left on deployment, they did this thing where the ladies would give gifts to the men before they went off to war, and her gift to him was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Boom! Finally, after 8 months of investigating, they had their man. So they tracked him down to notify his next of kin, and thankfully that was easy to do because he was still alive. He was still alive. Yeah, not only was he still alive, but he still had the copy of the book that Jo had given him, and yeah, nothing was torn out of it. And Jo signed it, but she signed it under a different name, Justin. Nobody's sure why. Her real name was Jessica. Maybe Justin was a take on Jessica. Maybe, I don't know, was she always Justin with people? I don't know. Australia. The point is, it was yet another promising lead that went nowhere. But what about that code? It consisted of 6 lines of random letters, 51 letters total, with 2 shortest lines crossed out. And look, here's the thing. I could go on and on about this code. I actually cut a whole bunch of stuff out of this script because it just keeps going. But the long and short of it is, nobody's ever cracked it. 74 years now, people have been trying. Nobody's ever done it. I could go into all the methods that were used and the different experts that were called in, theories around it. Some people suggested there might be micro-writing inside the lines of the letters that contain a second hidden code. Some people even tested whether or not it was just nothing but randomness by getting people drunk and having them draw names out of a hat. I'll put links down below if you think you can solve it, really have at it. But long story short, for whatever reason, there is an uncrackable code at the back of this book. So here come the spy theories. Some have speculated that the Somerton Man was a Soviet agent, and that Jessica, aka Joe, aka Justin, was his partner, contact, or handler. And I know you might be sitting there thinking, of course, some conspiracy theorists are going to make it about spying or the Cold War or something like that. That's always brought up in these cases. They said the same thing about Peter Bergman, said the same thing about the Isdal woman. But here's the thing. One of the people that believes this theory is Joe Thompson's daughter. Yeah, Kate Thompson, she's the daughter of Joe and George. She thinks her mother was a Soviet spy. She told Australia 60 Minutes that her mother could speak Russian, and nobody in the family knew how she learned that. She kept that a secret from everyone.
She said to me, "Oh, surprised that I could still quite understand Russian."
She dropped that bombshell.
Yeah, so when did you learn Russian? Well, that's for me to know.
She also says that her mom once told her that she did know who the Somerton Man was, but lied to the police about it because it was, quote, not at their level. What she didn't tell her, of course, was who the man actually was or how she knew him. But I mean, the spy thing, it kind of makes sense. I mean, dying from an undetectable poison is a pretty spy way to go. And this was right at the beginning of the Cold War. It's even possible he might have been a spy during World War II. But of course, if it's a spy thing, that brings up a million questions. I mean, had he been double-crossed or compromised in some way? Did he know too much? Did Joe actually have him killed? Was he protecting her? If the Somerton Man was a foreign agent, we'll probably never know exactly what happened to him. It's a mystery wrapped in an enigma, wrapped in a flour tortilla. A mystery burrito, if you will. But there is one more theory. It's a pretty compelling one. It's also one of the saddest. It's a theory put forth by Adelaide University professor Derek Abbott, who's been kind of obsessed with this case going all the way back to the 90s. He wanted to focus on the genetic abnormalities in the Somerton Man case, like the missing teeth, for example. That only shows up in 2.1% of males. But he also found something else. When he and his team got a chance to study the plaster cast, he noted something interesting about the ear. So our ears have a couple of structures in the external ear canal. There's the concha cymba in the upper portion and the concha cavum below. Usually the concha cymba is smaller than the concha cavum, but with the Somerton Man, it was reversed, with a large cymba and a small cavum. That's a small thing, probably not something most people would notice, which is why it went unnoticed for so long, but only 1 to 2% of Caucasian people have ears like that. So between the teeth thing and the ear thing, the chance that some totally unrelated person would have both of those two genetic abnormalities is really slim. And yet, they did find somebody with both of those traits. A guy named Robin Thompson. And yet, if that name Thompson sounds familiar, that's because his mother is Joe Thompson. I know, right, wait, it gets better. So Joe had been dating George Thompson for a few years at that point. She was even going by his name, so you could even say they were common law married if you want to. So when Robin was born, nobody questioned whether or not that was George's son. But Robin was born in 1947, which would have made him about 18 months old when the Somerton Man died. So, considering that he had the same teeth and the same ears as the Somerton Man, this got Derek Abbott more curious. He wanted to know more about him, like what he did for a living. And it turns out what he did for a living, he was a ballet dancer. Yes, Robin Thompson was a professional ballet dancer for the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company. There's plenty of pictures out there of him during his ballet company days. You can clearly see the teeth, you can see the ears, and those well-developed calves. The story just writes itself at this point. That Joe Thompson, spy or no spy, had an affair with the Somerton Man and gave birth to his child. Of course, being basically married to George Thompson at the time, she had to keep that secret and keep him away, and being spurned by the woman he loved and being forced to watch another man raise his child, the Somerton Man spiraled into a kind of depression and decided to take his own life, leaving one last heartbreaking note for her. It's romantic and tragic. Maybe he visited there 10 days before his death to make one final appeal to her, and after that failed, he stopped at a bookstore. Or if you still want to believe that he was murdered, maybe he threatened to reveal the truth about her son and she had him taken out. There's still the possibility that she was a spy. Unfortunately, we'll never get a confession out of Jo Thompson because she passed away in 2007. But fortunately, Professor Abbott had seen some episodes of Maury Povich, so he knew that a DNA test would clear this whole thing up. So he tried to contact Robin to see if he could get a DNA sample from him, but Robin had died literally 2 months before that and was cremated. By the way, it's a pretty good argument for not being cremated. You never know when your body might be needed to solve a 70-year-old mystery. This, I'm sure, was a huge disappointment to Professor Abbott, but he did have one more possible option. Robin had a daughter. Her name is Rachel Egan. She's the daughter of Roma Egan, who was also part of the Royal New Zealand Ballet Company with Robin. Lots of R's there. But somewhere along the way they had a daughter, and for unknown reasons they decided to give her up for adoption. So when Professor Abbott reached out to her about this, she was eager to find out more about her family and her potential grandfather. So yeah, she agreed to participate. The only problem was that the only DNA they had from the Somerton Man was some hair follicle DNA from the plaster cast. So not much to work with, but they gave it a shot. The results, just like everything in this case, just brought up more questions. Like, nothing was found that specifically tied her to the Somerton Man, but there were some markers that tied her to George Thompson. So does that kill the whole theory? Was George Thompson Robin's father the whole time? Maybe, maybe not. It was a small sample, and DNA analysis is far more complicated than what you see on TV. And it's possible that she might have been related to George Thompson through some other circuitous means. I mean, apparently she was also related to Thomas Jefferson. Or maybe Thomas Jefferson killed the Somerton... No, that wouldn't work. To be sure, they needed a better DNA sample, which the only way to get that is if they exhumed the body. And Professor Abbott worked for years to get this done. Eventually, his perseverance did finally pay off because in early 2021, the Somerton Man was exhumed. And now better DNA tests are now being conducted. So whether he turns out to be Rachel's grandfather or not, this should be a huge step forward in identifying the Somerton Man. And hopefully answer more questions than it brings up. Because right now, there's a lot of questions. Was he a spy that knew too much? A mobster who got in too deep? A jilted lover who couldn't see his son? Or just a dude with some banging legs that got a hold of the wrong book? With any luck, we'll find out soon. And the Somerton Man, whoever he is, may finally have some peace. By the way, as if this whole thing couldn't get any weirder, in the process of trying to solve this mystery together, Derek Abbott and Rachel Egan fell in love and got married. They'd been together for 11 years now and have 3 kids. After obsessing about this mystery man for decades, he may now be raising his great-grandkids. Can't make this stuff up. So yeah, Tamam Shud, only in fiction. Real life is just one darn thing after another. Which brings us to the next darn thing. All right, so as I said at the beginning, Derek Abbott did announce on Tuesday the 26th that they do have an identity for the Somerton Man, and his name is, drumroll please, actually, you know what? We're talking about a dead guy. That doesn't feel right. Drum roll doesn't feel right. Turn off the drum roll. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it doesn't work. His name was Carl Webb. Actually, his name was Carl, but he went by Charles, thus affirming that he's Australian. He was born in 1905 outside of Melbourne, actually, the youngest of 6 kids, and not much is really known about his early life, but he grew up to be an electrical engineer and an instrument maker, and that would have put him at about 43 years old when he died, assuming he was the Somerton Man. He married a woman named Dorothy Robinson, who went by Doff Webb, because Australia, and she filed for divorce from him in 1947, claiming that he had disappeared, and in fact, there was no public records of him after this point, including no death certificate. The next record they could find of Dorothy was in 1951, showing that she lived in Butte, South Australia, which is about 144 kilometers from Adelaide. So it is possible that he was in Adelaide trying to track her down, but that is just speculation. Now there is one other thing that ties him to the Somerton Man case. As I mentioned before, the name T. Keene was found on some of the Somerton Man's clothes, and apparently Carl Webb had a brother-in-law named Thomas Keene, and those clothes could have just been hand-me-downs. But before we go too far, you're probably wondering how they landed on Carl Webb. Well, Professor Abbott was working with an American forensic genealogist named Colleen Fitzpatrick from the group Identifinders International. Her name pops up in a lot of these cases because she's kind of a total badass at this. And they used the DNA that Abbott had extracted from the hair follicles from the plaster cast, and they specifically focused on the haplogroup H1A1A1A. Yeah, this is important to note. They did exhume the body, but as far as I could tell from the articles I read anyway, this has nothing to do with any tests that might have been done on the body itself. This is only from the hair follicles, so I'm going to assume that further tests on the body will be needed to, verify all this. Anyway, they ran all these tests against a genealogical database and found a living descendant that would have been Webb's first cousin 3 times removed on his mother's side. So from there, they kind of constructed a family tree that started with 4,000 names. And from that, they just kind of painstakingly chipped away at it and were able to triangulate it to Webb, a man who disappeared right around that time. And though Fitzgerald and Abbott claim that they're 99.999% sure that Webb is their guy, this is yet to be corroborated by the South Australian police. And like I said, these tests kind of need to match up with the tests being conducted on the body. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, they have not been able to find any photos so far of Carl Webb to sort of verify in that way. But like any good mystery, this kind of raises more questions than it answers. Like, what happened when he disappeared in 1947? Where was he for those 18 months between the divorce and his death? Why and how did he die? If he was from just one state over, how come nobody came forward to claim him because his picture had been shared around for nearly 75 years? Why was Joe Thompson's number in his book? What was that code all about? This is where we enter the speculation zone. As for the code, they say that there's evidence that Carl had bet on horses fairly regularly, so maybe that was just him keeping track of the horses. As for why he disappeared, one of the pieces of evidence in the case was that they found in his luggage some stencils, and they speculated that maybe he had worked on a merchant ship because they often use those to label crates. Well, maybe he had been out to sea during that time. Maybe that explains why he had some items from America that weren't available in Australia in his bag. Perhaps he and Doff had a falling out, so he took a job to kind of get some space, and then when he came back, he found out that she had divorced him and moved, and he went to Adelaide to try to track her down. As for Joe Thompson, maybe Dorothy knew Joe. Maybe they'd met previously in the past, and she turned to Joe for help after her divorce. Maybe she even moved in with her briefly. And in the course of tracking her down, he may have found Joe's number and just wrote it down in his book. By the way, I didn't mention this in a previous episode, but a lot of people pointed to the fact that it seems really coincidental how many copies of this obscure book of ancient Persian poetry keep turning up in this case. It was actually a fairly popular book back then. It has experienced a little bit of a resurgence in interest, in literary circles. So it really wasn't that random. Now to go deeper into speculation territory, and this just might be the storyteller in me taking over, but I can't help but wonder if maybe his relationship with Dorothy was toxic, maybe even abusive. Maybe she took the first opportunity she had to divorce him and then moved away trying to escape him and turned to Joe for help. Now, Joe claimed to not know who the person was, but her reaction to seeing the death mask apparently suggested otherwise. Now, that could just be her being uncomfortable looking at a dead man's face, but, she did tell her daughter that she did know him, but she said that she couldn't say anything, so maybe she was just protecting her friend. And if he was somebody that was unstable enough to pose a danger to Dorothy, maybe he was a danger to himself as well, and took himself out. Like I said, more questions than answers. Now, Abbott and Fitzgerald say that they have not been able to find any living relatives that have any memories whatsoever of Carl Webb, and after 75 years, that's probably really unlikely. But with 5 siblings, I have trouble believing that there's not a photo out there of him somewhere. I mean, that's what I want to see. I want to see a photo. And maybe with this new exposure, somebody in that lineage might have an old photo album laying around that will, come forward. That would be really cool. But what this evidence does seem to prove definitively is that Robin Thompson and his daughter Rachel Egan are definitely not descended from the Somerton Man, which Abbott says is actually kind of a relief to finally know the answer for. And I will say, Derek Abbott had been working on this theory for decades, and when the evidence didn't fit his theory, he didn't try to change the evidence to fit his theory, he changed his theory to fit the evidence, and that's admirable. But the South Australian police have not made a statement on this yet. It's only been a couple of days at the time of recording this, so it could come soon. As far as I know, they're still doing some tests on the body. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with there. And, like I said, the chance the new photo might come out there that would provide some more evidence that would tie this up with a bow is still a possibility. So it's not 100% over. There's still a lot of questions to answer, a lot of investigations taking place. It'll be interesting to see what darn thing happens next. And when it does, I'm sure I'll get a million emails about it. All right, thanks for watching. Again, we'll see if YouTube buries this one as well, but I'll put links down in the description to some articles that you can go check out for yourself. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care. All right, that was a lot of murder and mayhem, but hey, it's Halloween. It's in the spirit of the day. So if you stuck around to the end of this, I just want to say thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. And of course, also just thanks for supporting me this whole time. This whole 10 years I've been doing these videos. Your support has meant the world to me. And I'm just super lucky that I get to do this thing for a living. And we've been doing that whole thing where I ask people to comment an emoji at the end of this thing to show that you watched all the way through. We've been doing a little bit of a fruit salad, but it's Halloween, so let's have you add a pumpkin. Like, comment with a pumpkin. Kind of a weird addition to a fruit salad, but you know, nothing else really seemed right today. But anyway, here's wishing you a happy and safe Halloween, and I hope you have fun. And remember, if someone sneaks drugs into your kid's candy, please, 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 don't throw that away. That's free drugs, people. All right, so thanks for watching. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening weekend, and believe it or not, we've got a video coming up on Monday. Something very different. It's on Nebula right now. You should go check it out. But anyway, have a good one. Love you guys. Take care.